Good evening. Take a moment to settle in. Drop your shoulders, unclench your jaw, and take a deep, slow breath. Let the noise of the day fade behind you. Tonight, we travel to the high desert of the American West, to a silence built not of nature, but of concrete and steel. We follow the dark journey of a man who moved from the streets of Manila to the absolute stillness of the Rockies, earning a special kind of isolation along the way. So close your eyes and let's begin. In the high desert of Colorado, where the Rocky Mountains cast their shadows across windswept plains, there stands a facility unlike any other. It is a place designed not merely to confine, but to isolate, to render powerless those whom the nation has deemed too dangerous to exist among even the imprisoned. The Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. Supermax, the end of the line. Built in 1994 as an answer to a question no one wanted to ask. What do you do with prisoners so violent, so unpredictable, so willing to end life, that even maximum security facilities cannot contain them? 490 cells arranged in a labyrinth of corridors where sunlight rarely reaches. Each cell measures 7 feet by 12 feet, a bed bolted to the floor, a desk and stool fashioned from poured concrete, a stainless steel sink and toilet combination, a single window 4 inches wide, positioned so the prisoner cannot see the sky or the mountains or anything that might remind him of the world beyond. Among the men housed here is Jesse Conway. His name does not echo like some who share his confinement. He is not a terrorist who brought down buildings or a cartel lord who commanded armies. But those who have studied him, those who have stood in rooms with him and looked into his eyes, speak of him with a particular kind of unease. You could just sense evil on different inmates, one investigator would later say. He would have been one of those inmates. Conway is
47 years old now. He has spent more than half his life behind bars. 2 unlawful passes, multiple assaults with harmful weapons, threats against correctional officers, a disciplinary record that reads like a catalogue of institutional violence. But the file does not capture what cannot be written: the stillness of him, the way other inmates, even hardened men with their own terrible histories, gave him distance. Conway earned his place in the Supermax through choices that stretched across decades, through escalations that should have been stopped but were not, through a pattern so clear in hindsight that it seems impossible it was not recognized sooner. The journey that led him here began long before he ever saw the inside of a facility. It began in a different country, in a different life, among circumstances that seem almost designed to produce exactly what he became. This is the story of that journey. From the humid slums of Manila to a laundromat in Phoenix. From the tears of a Pennsylvania facility to the absolute silence of the Supermax. It is the story of a secret brotherhood known as the New Mexican Mafia. And it is the story of a quiet officer named Eric Williams, whose passing would change the American system forever. Before the prisoner, before the violence, before the darkness that would one day require the highest security measures America could devise, there was a boy born in the humid streets of Manila. January 17th, 1977, the beginning of a life that would demand, in its ending, absolute isolation from all humankind. In the high desert of Colorado, where the Rocky Mountains cast their shadows across windswept plains, there stands a facility unlike any other. It is a place designed not merely to confine, but to isolate, to render powerless those whom the nation has deemed too dangerous to exist among even the imprisoned. This is the story of one such man. The administrative maximum facility in Florence, Colorado, is known by another name: Supermax, the end of the line. Built in 1994, it was conceived as an answer to a question no one wanted to ask. What do you do with prisoners so violent, so unpredictable, so willing to end life that even maximum security facilities cannot contain them? The answer rises from the desert floor in concrete and steel. 490 cells arranged in a labyrinth of corridors where sunlight rarely reaches. Each cell measures 7 feet by 12 feet. A bed bolted to the floor. A desk and stool fashioned from poured concrete. A stainless steel sink and toilet combination. A single window, 4 inches wide, positioned so the prisoner cannot see the sky or the mountains or anything that might remind him of the world beyond. The men housed here are not ordinary criminals. They are not even ordinary perpetrators. They are the ones who ended lives while already imprisoned. The ones who orchestrated violence from behind bars. The ones who, when given every opportunity to simply serve their time in silence, chose instead to destroy. Among them is Jesse Conway. His name does not echo like some who share his confinement. He is not a terrorist who brought down buildings or a cartel lord who commanded armies. But those who have studied him, those who have stood in rooms with him and looked into his eyes, speak of him with a particular kind of unease. Not fear exactly, for they are professionals trained to see the worst of humanity without flinching. Something else. Recognition, perhaps, of a darkness without floor or ceiling. Conway is 47 years old now. He has spent more than half his life behind bars. His file, should one be permitted to read it, tells the story in bureaucratic language. 2 unlawful passes, multiple assaults with harmful weapons, threats against correctional officers, a disciplinary record that reads like a catalogue of institutional violence. But the file does not capture what cannot be written. The stillness of him. The way other inmates, even hardened men with their own terrible histories, gave him distance. Not the exaggerated space one gives to the loud and the boastful, but the instinctive retreat from something fundamentally wrong. One investigator who interviewed him in a previous facility remembers the encounter with uncomfortable clarity. Conway sat across the table, calm, his hands folded. He answered questions with a kind of bored politeness, but there was something beneath the surface, a sense that he was performing normalcy the way an actor performs a role, that the real Conway was somewhere deeper, watching, waiting for a reason to emerge. You could just sense evil on different inmates, the investigator would later say. He would have been one of those inmates. The architecture of the Supermax is designed around a simple premise: total control. Prisoners spend 23 hours each day in their cells. The remaining hour is spent in a slightly larger cage, a recreation area, where they can pace or exercise alone. There are no group activities, no communal dining, no gatherings of any kind. When a prisoner must be moved, it requires a carefully choreographed procedure. He is ordered to place his back against the cell door. His hands are cuffed through a slot. Only then does the door open. He is escorted by multiple officers, his movements restricted by restraints. Every hallway, every corner, every transition point
is monitored by cameras that record in high definition. There are no blind spots, no moments of unwatched privacy. For M. Mike Conway, this is not cruelty, it is a necessity. The isolation is not punishment for its own sake, though it may feel that way to those who endure it. It is the acknowledgement of a truth the system learned through blood and grief. Some men cannot be trusted in the presence of others. Some men, when given the smallest opportunity, will take a life. The staff at Florence speak of their work with a particular kind of weariness. They are not keepers in the traditional sense. They are custodians of last resort. They understand that the men in their care will likely never leave, will never stand trial again, or appear before a parole board with any hope of success. These are the warehouses, the permanently removed. And yet, even here, in this most secure of all American facilities, vigilance cannot be abandoned. An inmate with nothing to lose and a lifetime of violence behind him remains dangerous. Perhaps more grave, for he has no future to protect, no hope to preserve. His world has contracted to 7 feet by 12 feet, and in that small space, he exists outside the calculations that govern ordinary human behavior. Conway earned his place here. That is what the staff will tell you, without hesitation or doubt. He earned it through choices that stretched across decades, through escalations that should have been stopped, but were not, through a pattern so clear in hindsight that it seems impossible it was not recognized sooner. But patterns are only clear when viewed from a distance. At the moment, each incident appears isolated. A threat here, an assault there, a prisoner acting out, then returning to quiet compliance. It is only when you step back, when you trace the line from beginning to end, that you see the trajectory. And by then, it is far too late. The journey that led Jesse Conway to the Supermax began long before he ever saw the inside of a facility. It began in a different country, in a different life, among circumstances that seem almost designed to produce exactly what he became: poverty and violence, displacement and loss, the slow accumulation of traumas that build like sediment, layer upon layer, until they harden into something unbreakable. But to say his fate was inevitable would be to absolve him, and that is not what the record shows. At every turn, there were choices, moments when the path could have diverged, when help was offered, or opportunity presented itself, or consequences might have served as warning. He chose violence. Again and again, when faced with the fork in the road, he chose the darker way, not because he had no other option, but because something in him was drawn to it. Something that is found in cruelty is not just a tool, but a truth. The Supermax in Florence houses just over 400 inmates at any given time. In a federal system that holds more than 150,000 people, this represents a fraction of a fraction. The worst of the worst, as the phrase goes, the irredeemable. Whether any human being is truly irredeemable remains a question that philosophers and theologians have debated since the beginning of conscience. The law does not traffic in such abstractions. It deals in behavior and consequence, in acts committed and punishments rendered. Jesse Conway has been judged by the law, twice for ending a life, many more times for violence, and each time the system has responded by moving him deeper into isolation. From the general population to restricted housing, from medium security to high security,
from high security to maximum, and finally to this place of last resort. Here he will remain, not because there is nowhere left to send him, but because there is no reason to send him anywhere else. The system, having exhausted all other options, has arrived at its final answer: permanent separation, total containment, an existence measured in decades spent in a concrete box, watched by cameras that never blink, guarded by men who never forget what he is capable of. But the question remains: how does a person become this? What combination of circumstance and choice, of trauma and tendency, of environment and essence, produces a man whom society must lock away from all human contact? To answer that, we must return to the beginning, to a humid city half a world away, to a boy who had not yet learned what he would become. Before the prisoner, before the violence, before the darkness that would one day require the highest security measures America could devise, there was a boy born in the humid streets of Manila. January 17th, 1977. The beginning of a life that would demand, in its ending, absolute isolation from all humankind. Manila, capital of the Philippines, sprawls across the shores of a great bay. It is a city of contrasts, of Spanish colonial architecture standing alongside modern towers, of wealth concentrated in fortified enclaves, while poverty spreads through neighborhoods so densely packed that walking through them feels like moving through a living organism. The air smells of cooking fires and exhaust, of the sea and of humanity pressed too close together. It was in one of Manila's largest slums that Jesse Conway entered the world. His mother was young, his father older, and their home was a structure that could barely be called such. Corrugated metal sheets for a roof, walls that let in the rain when the monsoons came. No running water, no electricity, or only intermittent power siphoned from city lines in ways that were not quite legal, but were quietly tolerated. The family was not large by the standards of the neighborhood. Jesse had a sister and 2 brothers, 4 children in a space that would have been cramped for 2. They slept on mats that were rolled up during the day. They ate rice and dried fish when there was money, and less when there was not. They relied on a local church for support, standing in lines with dozens of other families to receive food donations and secondhand clothing. This was not unusual. Thousands of families lived this way in Manila, their lives defined by scarcity and resilience in equal measure. For the children, it was simply the world as they knew it. They played in the narrow alleys between homes. They scavenged for anything useful in the waste that accumulated in the streets. They learned early that survival required resourcefulness and that asking for help was not weakness, but necessity. But within this world of shared hardship, there existed a private suffering that the neighbors might have heard, but could not prevent. Jesse's father was a man of temper and violence. The sounds that came from their home in the dark hours were familiar to those who lived close by. A woman's voice raised in fear or pain, the thud of impact, the crying that followed. Jesse was 3 years old when he first became aware of these sounds as something wrong. There is debate among those who study childhood development about how much a child of that age can understand, can remember. But the research suggests that memory begins earlier than we once believed. That trauma, even when not fully comprehended, leaves its mark on the developing brain. To witness violence between one's parents at such a tender age is to learn lessons that cannot be unlearned.
that the world is not safe, that love and harm can coexist, that power belongs to those
willing to use force. These are not lessons taught in words, but absorbed through experience, woven into the fabric of how a child comes to understand relationships and conflict and control. And then, when Jesse was only 4.5 years old, came a loss that no amount of poverty or hardship had prepared the family to endure. His younger brother, the child closest to him in age and in affection, fell ill. In the slums of Manila, illness moved quickly among children. Diseases that would have been treatable with proper medical care became end-of-life sentences for families who could not afford doctors or medicine. The boy passed away. Jesse, barely old enough to understand permanence, lost the companion of his earliest years. The research on childhood bereavement tells us that children process passing differently than adults. They may not grasp its finality immediately. They may expect the person to return, but they feel the absence, the hole where someone used to be. And in that absence, other things can take root. Anger, perhaps, or a kind of numbness that protects the heart from feeling too much. It was during this period of mourning that Jesse's mother met a new man, an American, a serviceman stationed at one of the United States Air Force bases that had been established in the Philippines decades earlier, during the long American military presence in the region. She ran a small barbecue stand outside the base, selling grilled meat and rice to soldiers who had money to spend and a taste for local food. The American was drawn to her, as soldiers often were to the women who worked near the bases. These relationships were common, some fleeting and transactional, others developing into something more lasting. For Jesse's mother, this man represented possibility. Not just companionship, but escape from the slum that had taken one of her children and threatened to claim the others. The courtship was swift. The American was not young himself, and he was looking for something permanent. He proposed marriage, and she accepted. For the children, their father's absence had created a void, and now this stranger would fill it. A stepfather, an American stepfather who spoke a different language and came from a world they could barely imagine. Jesse was now living in a household altered beyond recognition. His biological father had left when he was young enough that his memories of the man were fragmentary and dark. The violence, the shouting, these remained, but the face attached to them grew hazy. Now there was this new presence, this American who would shape the next phase of his life in ways both profound and destructive. The research on step-family dynamics is clear. Children often struggle with the introduction of a step-parent, particularly when that introduction comes on the heels of loss or trauma. There is a period of adjustment that can be difficult even in the best circumstances. Trust must be built, boundaries must be negotiated. And when the step-parent comes from an entirely different culture, with different expectations about discipline and family and respect, the adjustment becomes exponentially more complex. For Jesse, at an age when the world was already confusing and frightening, when he had witnessed violence and lost a brother and seen his family's circumstances shift like sand, this was yet another upheaval, another lesson that stability was an illusion, that the people and places you knew could vanish or transform without warning. And yet, from the outside, it might have looked like a blessing. An American serviceman marrying a Filipino woman and agreeing to take her children as his own. The promise of a better life. The possibility of leaving the slum behind. The dream that so many in Manila harbored, of escape to America, where the streets were said to be clean and the opportunities endless. It is worth pausing here to consider the weight of these early years. We are not yet speaking of crime or violence committed by Jesse himself. We are speaking only of what was done to him and around him, the violence he witnessed, the brother he lost, the poverty that defined his earliest understanding of the world, the displacement that would soon come. None of this excuses what would follow. The adult makes his own choices, and Jesse Conway would make choices that placed him beyond the reach of sympathy. But to understand how a person arrives at such choices, we must first understand where the journey began. And it began here, in a slum in Manila, with a small boy who had already learned that the world was neither kind nor fair. The human mind is not a simple machine that produces predictable outputs from given inputs. Two children can experience identical traumas and emerge as entirely different people. One may become resilient, even compassionate, shaped by suffering into someone determined to prevent it in others. Another may become hard, violent, shaped by suffering into someone who inflicts it without hesitation. Scientists and psychologists speak of risk factors and protective factors. The things that make a bad outcome more likely and the things that guard against it. A violent home is a risk factor. So is poverty. So is the loss of a sibling at a critical developmental stage. But protective factors can mitigate these risks. A loving caregiver, a stable community, access to education or mental health support, a sense of hope or purpose. For Jesse Conway, in the slums of Manila at age 4 and 5 and 6, the protective factors were few. His mother loved him, surely, but she was overwhelmed, grieving, trying to survive. His siblings were there, but children cannot protect each other from the larger forces that shape their lives. The church provided food, but not therapy or counseling or the kind of sustained intervention that might have made a difference. And so the boy grew, accumulating experiences like scars. Each one small, perhaps. Each one survivable. But together, building towards something that could not be easily undone. The American stepfather made his plans. He would finish his service in the Philippines, and then he would return to the United States. And when he did, he would take his new family with him. The children would become American. They would have opportunities their mother could never have provided in Manila. They would go to school, learn English, and build lives in the land of plenty. For Jesse, 9 years old now and unaware of what awaited him, this was the next turn of the wheel. Another uprooting, another journey into the unknown. The slums of Manila had been harsh, but they had been home. What came next would be something else entirely. At 9 years old, Jesse Conway crossed the Pacific Ocean. Rome, New York awaited, a city of promise to some, but to a Filipino boy who spoke little English, it would become another kind of facility. The journey itself was long. Manila to the West Coast, then across the continental United States to upstate New York. For a child who had never left the neighborhood of his birth, who had known only the dense humidity and endless noise of the slum, the experience must have been overwhelming. The airplane cabin with its recycled air and cramped seats. The airports, vast and sterile, filled with people moving purposefully toward destinations Jesse could not imagine. And finally, the arrival in a place so unlike Manila that it might as well have been another planet. Rome, New York sits in Oneida County, not far from the Adirondack Mountains. It is a small city, population just over 30,000, built on the site of an old military installation. Fort Stanwix had stood there during the Revolutionary War, and the military presence had never quite left. The Air Force Base, where Jesse's stepfather had been stationed, was the reason the family settled there. It was what the man knew. It was where he could find work and housing and a community of other veterans who had made similar transitions. For Jesse's mother, the move represented everything she had hoped for. A house with walls that did not leak, running water, electricity that did not flicker and failed, schools for her children, safety. The American dream, as it had been sold to her, was not about wealth or luxury. It was about stability, about knowing that her children would eat every day and sleep in beds and have chances she had never been given. But for Jesse, the dream felt more like exile. Imagine, if you will, the shock of displacement at such an age. Everything familiar has been stripped away. The language you speak is not the language spoken around you. The food tastes wrong. The weather is wrong. In Manila, the temperature varied only slightly throughout the year, hovering always in the warmth. In upstate New York, winter came with a cold that bit through clothing and turned the world white and silent. The other children at school stared at him, not always with hostility, but with curiosity that felt like a kind of violence. He was different. His skin was darker, his name was foreign. His English, learned only recently and imperfectly, marked him as an outsider. When he spoke with an accent. When he tried to make friends, the cultural gap seemed uncrossable. Developmental psychologists who study immigrant children speak of the unique stresses they face. On the surface, we celebrate immigration as an opportunity, and for many it is. But for a child, the experience is more complex. You are expected to abandon the identity you have begun to form, to learn not just a new language, but new ways of being, new social rules, new expectations about how to move through the world. And while you are learning all of this, you are also attending school, where you are measured against children who were born into this language and this culture. You fall behind not because you are less intelligent, but because you are operating at a disadvantage that no one fully acknowledges. The teacher speaks too quickly. The homework assignments assume cultural knowledge you do not possess. The other students form friendships based on shared experiences you cannot access. Jesse struggled. His grades were poor, not because he lacked ability, but because he was trying to learn mathematics and history and science in a language he barely spoke. The school system in Rome had resources for English as a second language students, but those resources were limited. A few hours a week with a specialist could not bridge the gap. The rest of the time, he was drowning. And then there were the bullies. Every school has them. Boys, usually, though not always, who have learned that social status can be won through domination. They identify the weakest targets, the ones who will not or cannot fight back, and they pursue them with a cruelty that adults often fail to recognize or address. Teachers see it as teasing, as boys being boys, but to the child in the receiving end, it is a daily assault on dignity and safety. Jesse was an obvious target. He was foreign. He was struggling academically. He was small for his age, still carrying the effects of childhood malnutrition from his years in Manila. The bullies mocked his accent. They pushed him in the hallways. They stole his lunch. They made his name into a joke, twisting the pronunciation until it became a slur. The research on bullying tells us that its effects can be profound and lasting. Children who are bullied consistently show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. They may develop a mistrust of others that persists into adulthood. They may internalize the message that they deserve the treatment they receive, leading to low self-esteem and a sense of worthlessness. Or they may develop a different response. They may learn that the world is divided into predators and prey, and they may resolve never again to be prey. For Jesse, the message being reinforced was one he had already learned in Manila. That belonging is fragile, that home is nowhere, that protection comes only from strength, and strength is defined by the willingness to do violence. At home, things were no easier. His stepfather was not a gentleman. He had served in the military, and he brought military discipline to his household. There were rules, strictly enforced, chores that had to be completed to exacting standards, consequences for failure that were swift and harsh. The stepfather was not abusive in the way Jesse's biological father had been. There was no drunken rage, no random explosions of violence. But there was a rigidity, a harshness that left no room for the struggles Jesse was experiencing. When Jesse brought home poor grades, he was punished. When he complained about school, he was told to toughen up. When he showed signs of depression or withdrawal, he was accused of laziness. In the stepfather's worldview, Jesse had been given an extraordinary gift. He had been brought to America. He had been given opportunities that millions of Filipino children would never have, and he was squandering them through lack of effort and discipline. The stepfather could not see, or would not see, that the gift he believed he had given was experienced by Jesse as something closer to theft. The theft of everything familiar. The theft of identity. The dynamic between step-parent and step-child is always delicate. Research shows that step-families take years to integrate successfully, if they integrate at all. There must be patience. There must be empathy. There must be an understanding that the child has not chosen this arrangement and may harbor resentment about it. But patience was not the stepfather's strength. He had expectations, and Jesse was failing to meet them. The more Jesse struggled, the more the stepfather withdrew affection and approval. And the more approval was withheld, the more Jesse internalized a sense of worthlessness and rage. The family attended church as they had in Manila. The congregation was diverse, filled with other military families and immigrants from various countries. Jesse's mother hoped that the church community would provide support and help her children adjust to their new life. And for some of the children, perhaps it did. But Jesse found no comfort there. The sermons were in English he could barely follow. The other children in the youth group had already formed their cliques and saw no reason to include him. He sat in pews, silent and isolated, counting the minutes until he could leave. In the neighborhood, there were other immigrant families, other children from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from Latin America. These were the children who understood what it meant to be caught between worlds, to be too foreign for the Americans and too American too quickly for the people back home. Jesse might have found community among them, might have built friendships based on shared experience. But something in him resisted. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was a deeper alienation that made connection impossible. He remained alone, moving through his days with a growing sense that he did not belong anywhere. Not in America, not in the Philippines, not in his own family. The years in Rome, New York, were supposed to be the foundation of a better life. But for Jesse, they became instead another layer of trauma, another accumulation of experiences that taught him the world was hostile and belonging was impossible. He was not yet violent, not yet a criminal, but the seeds were germinating in soil made fertile by abandonment and pain. The question was not whether they would grow, but how tall and how dark the harvest would be. And soon, the family would move again, another uprooting, another journey to an unfamiliar place. Jesse was 9 when he came to Rome. He would be 16 when they left. 7 years of struggling to find footing in ground that never solidified beneath his feet. 7 years of building nothing that could last. The American dream, as it had been promised, remained always just out of reach. And Jesse, growing older and harder with each passing season, was beginning to believe it had never been meant for him at all. In the soft, shifting sands of the American Southwest, time seems to move with a different weight, stretching across the sun-bleached horizons, where the desert heat hums like a low, constant note. At 16 years of age, the landscape of Jesse Conway's life changed once again, trading the humid, crowded air of New York for the dry, unyielding brilliance of Phoenix, Arizona. It was a place of vast, open spaces and ancient stone. Yet for a boy who had spent his life being uprooted, the desert offered no sanctuary, only a new and harsher kind of isolation. The move across the country was more than a change of scenery. It was a severance of what few fragile roots Jesse had managed to grow in the soil of the East Coast. To be 16 is to exist in a state of delicate transition, a period where the architecture of the self is still being built, brick by brick, upon the foundation of one's environment. When that environment is stripped away for the second time in a decade, the foundation begins to crack. In the quiet heat of the Arizona afternoon, Jesse found himself standing at a threshold, looking out at a city that felt as alien as the one he had left behind in the Philippines. The palm trees stood like silent sentries against a sky of bruised purple and gold, offering no answers to a young man who had forgotten how to ask the questions. The transition to Phoenix was marked by a deepening silence at home and a growing noise within his own mind. Adaptation is a skill that requires a sense of safety, a belief that the effort of fitting in will be rewarded with a sense of belonging. But Jesse had learned, through the harsh lessons of his childhood, that belonging was a phantom, a ghost that vanished the moment he reached out to touch it. In the high schools of Phoenix, he was not the boy from Manila or the boy from Rome. He was simply a shadow, a figure moving through the corridors with eyes that had seen too much and hands that felt too heavy. The bullying that had defined his earlier years may have softened into a cold indifference from his peers, but the internal damage was already done. He was a wanderer in his own life, drifting through the hallways of a school system that viewed him as a statistic waiting to happen. It was during these long, arid months that the experimentation began. When the world outside feels too sharp, too loud, or too empty, the mind seeks a way to soften the edges. Jesse turned to the artificial calm of substances, looking for a way to quiet the echoes of the domestic violence he had witnessed as a toddler and the grief of the brother he had lost in the slums of Manila. Substances offered a temporary bridge over the abyss of his own anxiety, a way to numb the shame and embarrassment had trailed him across 2 continents. But the bridge was made of glass, and it began to shatter almost as soon as he stepped upon it. The descent was not a sudden fall, but a slow, rhythmic sliding away from the structures of society. He began to skip school,
finding more comfort in the aimless wandering of the Phoenix streets than in the structured silence of the classroom. The desert sun is indifferent to the struggles of man. It shines with the same intensity upon the palace and the gutter. Jesse found himself drawn to the fringes, to the places where the light didn't reach, and where the rules of the world felt less binding. His attendance at school dropped away until it was nothing more than a memory, leading eventually to his expulsion. The doors of education, which represent the traditional path to the American dream, were closed and locked, leaving him standing on the outside of a future he no longer believed in. Conflict within the home grew with the same intensity as the desert heat. His relationship with his stepfather, an American serviceman who had once represented a promise of stability, had soured into a constant, grinding confrontation. There is a specific kind of sorrow in a house where the air is thick with unspoken resentments and the sudden, sharp bursts of an argument. Jesse, trapped between the memories of his biological father's violence and the rigid, harsh discipline of his stepfather, found no peace beneath his own roof. The home, which should have been a fortress against the world, had become another battlefield. Eventually, the tension reached a breaking point that could not be mended. In a moment that would define the trajectory of his young adulthood, Jesse was kicked out of the house. He was 17, standing on the sun-pitted asphalt with everything he owned carried in a few bags, cast out into a world that had never truly invited him in. It is a moment of profound vulnerability, a turning point where the path forks between redemption and ruin. For Jesse, the path toward redemption felt like an uphill climb through shifting sand, while the path toward ruin was a smooth, downhill slope that required no effort at all. While his older brother found a sense of purpose and identity within the structured world of the United States Air Force, eventually building a decorated and honorable career, Jesse found himself adrift in the undercurrents of the city. The contrast between the two brothers serves as a somber reflection on the mystery of the human spirit. Two children, born of the same trauma and carried across the same oceans, yet one found the strength to soar, while the other began to sink into the dark. Jesse did make an attempt to follow in his brother's footsteps, seeking to enlist in the military in an effort to find the discipline and belonging he so desperately lacked. Perhaps he hoped that the uniform would act as a second skin, a way to hide the scars of his past and the uncertainty of his future, but the military rejected him. It was a final, crushing blow to his sense of self-worth. The institution that had given his brother a life and a legacy had deemed Jesse unfit to serve. In the quiet aftermath of that rejection, the last flickering lights of a conventional life seemed to go out. Every time a door had opened that might have led him toward the light, it had been slammed shut, sometimes by fate and sometimes by his own hand. There was no one there to catch him, no hand to reach into the dark and pull him back toward the path of the living. With the military closed to him and his family life in ruins, Jesse drifted deeper into the criminal underworld of Phoenix. It began with small acts, the petty thefts and minor transgressions of a young man who had nothing left to lose. Crime provided a strange, distorted version of the things he lacked. It gave him a sense of control, a momentary release from the crushing weight of his own insignificance, and a community of sorts among others who had also been cast out. The substance use that had started as a way to numb his pain now became a central pillar of his existence, a hungry ghost that demanded more than he could ever hope to provide. The tragedy of this period lies in its inevitability. When a young man is uprooted, ostracized, bullied, and eventually abandoned, the vacuum left behind is rarely filled with anything good.
Jesse was a vessel waiting for a purpose, and when society offered him none, he found one in the shadows. He was 19 years of age when the slow drift finally carried him into the iron embrace of the system. In 1996, he was convicted of 2 counts of theft and sentenced to the Arizona State Prison Complex in Winslow. Entering a facility at 19 is like entering a city where the clocks have stopped and the sun never sets. It is a world of concrete and steel, governed by a set of ancient, unwritten laws that have nothing to do with the laws of the land. For Jesse, Winslow was not a place of rehabilitation, but a place of dark education. It was here, in the quiet, dangerous corridors of the state penitentiary, that he first encountered the group that would provide him with the final, distorted identity he had been seeking since he left the slums of Manila. He did not see a gang. He saw a brotherhood. He did not see a criminal organization. He saw a fortress where he could finally belong. The new Mexican Mafia was an entity born of necessity and violence, a shadow that stretched across the Arizona desert and into the very heart of the system. For a young man who had spent his life being told he was nothing, the prospect of being a part of something so powerful and feared was intoxicating. He began to look at the older, seasoned members of the gang with a sense of awe, seeing in their tattoos and their cold, measured violence a way to finally be seen. He was no longer the boy who was bullied in Rome, New York. He was no longer the son who was kicked down in Phoenix. In the silence of his cell, Jesse began to weave a new story for himself, one where he was the aggressor instead of the victim, the hunter instead of the prey. As he sat in the Winslow facility, listening to the rhythmic clang of the cell doors and the low murmur of the yard, Jesse Conway began to embrace the darkness that had been gathering around him for years. The transition from the desert streets to the facility walls was the final step in a long process of self-destruction, a journey that had begun in a house without running water and was now nearing its true and terrible destination. He had found his place in the world at last, but it was a place where the air was thin and the light was fading. The desert night in Arizona is cold, a sudden and sharp departure from the heat of the day, much like the life Jesse had chosen to lead. He had walked away from the light of a normal existence and entered a world where the only thing that mattered was survival and the loyalty to a shadow. But the walls were not just a boundary, they were an incubator. And within them, the seeds of violence that had been planted in his childhood were beginning to break through the soil, reaching toward a dark and blooming maturity. In the Arizona State Prison at Winslow, the air is often still, a heavy blanket of desert heat that seems to press the very breath from the lungs of those within. Here, behind the high, sun-scalded walls and the shimmering coils of razor wire, Jesse Conway found a different kind of brotherhood, one etched in ink, bound by blood, and rooted in the deep, silent shadows of the American penal system. It was a world where identity was not a choice, but a survival strategy. And for a young man who had spent his life drifting like a leaf in a storm, the discovery of a structured, formidable power offered a seductive and terrible sense of gravity. To understand the path Jesse chose, one must look back to the origins of the shadow that fell over him. In the world of the incarcerated, lineage is often the first and most unyielding border, a line drawn in the dust of the exercise yard that few dare to cross. In the 1950s, within the stark concrete corridors of the Californian penitentiaries, a group of Mexican inmates sought to forge a shield against the violence of others. They called themselves the Mexican Mafia, or La M, a title that would eventually become synonymous with a complex and lethal order of control. What began as a pact of protection evolved over decades into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country, its influence reaching through the bars and into the streets, a hidden government of the dispossessed. As the years passed and the desert cities grew, an offshoot of this power moved across the border into Arizona. It became known as the New Mexican Mafia, a younger, more aggressive branch that sought to claim the population of the state's burgeoning system for its own.
This was the brotherhood that Jesse encountered at the age of 19 while serving his sentence for theft. To the uninitiated, the yard is a place of chaos and noise. But to someone like Jesse, it was a place of hierarchies and hidden signals. He saw the way the other inmates moved, the quiet respect paid to certain figures, the distinctive tattoos that marked a man as a made member, and the absolute clarity of their laws. The New Mexican Mafia operated on a philosophy known as blood in, blood out. It is a concept as old as the desert itself. To enter the brotherhood, one must spill blood, and the only exit from the pact is through the shedding of one's own life. For a young man who had felt invisible for so long, the weight of such a commitment was not a deterrent, but a lure. The gang provided a sense of false support, a distorted mirror of the family he had lost and the military career that had rejected him. It offered an identity that was absolute. He was no longer a boy from the slums or a failed recruit. He was a potential member of an elite, shadowed army. In those early days at Winslow, the recruitment process was shifting. The New Mexican Mafia was in a period of expansion, a silent war for territory against the older factions of the Mexican Mafia. They were looking for soldiers, men who were hungry for belonging and willing to set aside their own humanity in service of the group. Despite his Filipino heritage, Jesse found himself drawn into their orbit. The gang was somewhat looser in its recruitment than the original Californian branch, focusing more on loyalty and the capacity for violence than on strict ethnic lines. They provided him with a sense of purpose that the outside world had failed to offer, a way to navigate the dangerous currents of the yard with a name at his back that demanded silence. The internal life of the New Mexican Mafia was governed by a strict, almost monastic set of rules. While they dealt in the chaos of narcotics and extortion, their own ranks were expected to maintain a rigorous discipline. Leadership demanded absolute obedience. Meetings were held in whispers in the corners of the yard, or through messages scrawled on tiny scraps of paper, known as kites, passed hand to hand through the bars. For Jesse, this was the structure he had craved. A world where the expectations were clear and the consequences of failure were final. It was a dark reflection of the military life he had once desired. A community of men bound together by a shared history of struggle and a mutual pact of silence. Locked up in Winslow at 19, Jesse quickly began to prove his worth to the Brotherhood. He did not seek the quiet path of the model prisoner. Instead, he sought the reputation of a man who was willing to strike. He developed a plan to assault 4 other inmates, a move designed to elevate his standing within the gang and show that his hands were capable of the work the leadership required. It was a cold, premeditated calculation, a shedding of the last vestiges of his civilian conscience. However, the walls of a facility have ears, and an informant notified the staff before the plan could be carried out. Jesse was convicted of making threats, an act that only added to his sentence but solidified his status as a man to be watched. Just 8 months later, the darkness within him flared again. While still at Winslow, he assaulted another inmate using a metal food tray, a sudden and brutal explosion of violence in the middle of a mundane routine. To the administrators, it was a disciplinary infraction. To Jesse, it was a baptism. He pleaded guilty to the charge, accepting the additional time as a small price for the respect it earned him on the yard. We must consider the forces that were converging upon him during this time. There was the predisposition to violence he had witnessed in his father, the harsh and unforgiving discipline of his stepfather, and the numbing influence of the substances he had used to quiet his mind. But more than anything, there was the gang, a culture that did not just tolerate violence, but nurtured it, treating it as the only currency that held value in the dark. The New Mexican Mafia functioned as a surrogate parent, providing guidance and nurturance under the guise of total manipulation. The older, seasoned members, the carnales, or brothers, would take younger men like Jesse under their wing, offering protection in exchange for absolute servitude. They understood that an adolescent who felt astray in life would do anything for a sense of belonging. They gave him a history, a language, and a purpose, but it was a purpose that served only the interests of the organization. Jesse was becoming a weapon, a tool to be used in the gang's ongoing effort to control the population and the lucrative trade within the Arizona Department of Corrections. As he moved through his 21st year, Jesse was no longer the boy who had struggled
to learn English, or the teenager who had been kicked out of his home. He was a man of the shadows, his skin beginning to be marked by the ink of his affiliations. He lived for the standing counts and the rhythm of the gates. His world narrowed to the size of a concrete cell in the politics of the exercise yard. The New Mexican Mafia had become his universe, and their enemies had become his. He had traded the uncertainty of freedom for the clarity of the cage, and in doing so, he had begun to lose the ability to see his fellow man as anything other than a target or a resource. The expansion of the system in Arizona during the 1990s provided fertile ground for the New Mexican Mafia's growth. With every new facility built, the Brotherhood sent its soldiers to establish a foothold, to recruit the young and the lost, and to ensure that their influence was felt in every corner of the state. Jesse was part of this rising tide, a soldier in a war that most of the world outside the walls would never even know was being fought. He was learning the art of the shakedown, the necessity of the blade, and the power of a reputation built on the fear of others. Yet, despite the structure of the gang, Jesse remained a loner at heart, a man who moved within the group but seemed to exist in a cold, private space of his own. Even his brothers in the Mafia noticed the way he watched the world, a gaze that was detached, analytical, and devoid of empathy. It was as if the trauma of his early life had hollowed out a space within him that no brotherhood could ever truly fill. He was a made member in the eyes of the gang, but in his own soul, he was still the boy standing on the sun-pitted asphalt, watching the world move on without him. The journey from a theft conviction to a life of gang-sanctioned violence was nearly complete. By the time he was 24, Jesse Conway was no longer a drifting youth. He was a committed operative of one of the most dangerous organizations in the country. He had survived the trials of Winslow and emerged as a man who viewed the world through the bars of his own making. The Brotherhood had given him a home, but it was a home built of iron and stone, and the rent was paid in the blood of those he was told to hate. As the desert sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard, The first chapter of Jesse's life as a gangster was coming to a close. He had proven his loyalty and his capacity for harm, and now the gates were beginning to open once more, leading him back toward a society he no longer understood, and a freedom he would use only as a weapon. The world outside awaited him, but he was returning as a ghost of his former self, a man whose heart had been measured and found to be as cold as the cell he left behind. The threads of fate were winding tighter, drawing him toward a meeting with a mentor that would end in a laundromat, and a path that would eventually lead to the world-silent corridors of Canaan. For a brief, flickering season, the desert sun seemed to shine on a different version of the man who had known only the cold embrace of iron and the harsh lessons of the yard. In December of 2001, after serving 6.5 years within the state penitentiary, Jesse Conway was released into the sprawling, sun-drenched expanse of Arizona, a world that moved with a frantic energy he had not touched since his youth. This period would later be remembered not as a true beginning, but as a false spring, a quiet, deceptively calm interlude where the world of light and the world of shadow held their breath, waiting to see which path the traveler would ultimately claim. Upon his release, Jesse appeared to be a man who had finally heard the quiet whispers of redemption. The transition from the structured, violent hierarchy of a facility to the open-ended freedom of the streets is often a jarring experience, one that requires a steady hand and a patient heart. Surprisingly, Jesse seemed to find his footing. He sought out gainful employment, a feat that is often the greatest hurdle for those carrying the weight of a record. He found a position as an assistant manager at a local pharmacy, a role that demanded responsibility, punctuality, and a public-facing demeanor that was a far cry from the guarded silence of the Winslow corridors. In this mundane suburban setting, Jesse wore the mask of a common citizen. He moved through the aisles of the store, organizing the shelves and managing the small daily needs of the community. To the customers who passed him by, he was simply another face in the tapestry of the city, a man working his way toward a modest piece of the American dream. He attended substance treatment programs with a regularity that suggested a genuine desire to purge the toxins of his past. The records from this time tell a story of remarkable discipline. Over the course of a year, he underwent 34 consecutive tests, and every single one returned clean. In the eyes of the law and the eyes of his employers, Jesse was a success story, a man who had survived the crucible of the new Mexican Mafia and emerged with his soul intact. But beneath this veneer of order, the roots of his past remained coiled in the dark. The new Mexican Mafia is not an organization one simply walks away from. It is a blood pact that stretches far beyond the walls and into the very streets where the sun shines most brightly. While Jesse spent his days in the fluorescent light of the pharmacy, his nights and his loyalties still belonged to the shadows. The gang's leadership maintained a strict policy against substance use among its members, a rule born not of morality, but of pragmatism. A sober soldier is a reliable soldier, and a made member who remains clean is a man who can be trusted with the gang's most sensitive business. Jesse's clean tests were not necessarily a sign of a moral awakening. They were, in a way, his greatest credential within the underworld. They proved to the leadership that he was disciplined, that he was capable of maintaining a cover, and that he was ready for higher levels of responsibility. While he fulfilled his duties at the pharmacy, he was simultaneously serving a man named Carlos Garcia. Garcia was a member of the new Mexican Mafia, a veteran of the system who had navigated the politics of the yard for decades. To the younger Jesse, Garcia was more than a superior. He was a mentor, a figure of guidance in a world that had offered Jesse very little in the way of fatherly direction. In the quiet hours after the store closed, Jesse worked as an associate for Garcia, running errands that existed in the gray spaces of the law. He collected debts, delivered messages, and ensured that the gang's interests were protected in the local neighborhoods. It was a dual life, a rhythmic oscillation between the sterile aisles of the pharmacy and the grit of the Mafia Arizona backstreets. This duality is common in the lives of those who are caught between two worlds, the performative life of the citizen and the hidden life of the operative. Jesse was becoming an expert in the art of the mask, a man who could speak the language of management during the day and the language of extortion at night. The relationship between Jesse and Carlos Garcia was built on a foundation of perceived brotherhood. Garcia took Jesse under his wing, offering him a sense of protection and a glimpse into the inner workings of the organization. For a man who had been uprooted and ostracized throughout his childhood, this nurturance was a powerful incentive. It provided him with a sense of identity that the store could never offer. In the pharmacy, he was replaceable. In the Mafia, he was a brother. But the mentorship of Carlos Garcia was a hollow thing, a relationship defined by manipulation disguised as care. Garcia saw in Jesse a useful tool, a loyal soldier who would do the heavy lifting while Garcia reaped the rewards. As the months turned into a year, the false spring of Jesse's life began to lose its warmth. The pressure of maintaining two identities started to weigh upon him, and the internal contradictions of the New Mexican Mafia began to surface. While the gang preached a code of loyalty and brotherhood, the reality was often one of greed and internal betrayal. Carlos Garcia, the man Jesse looked up to, was playing a dangerous game of his own. He was skimming money from the gang's profits, keeping for himself what should have been shared with the leadership. He was also distancing himself from the very organization that had given him his power, missing meetings and ignoring the dictates of the bosses who watched from within the walls. What Jesse did not yet know was that the leadership of the New Mexican Mafia was becoming aware of Garcia's transgressions. In the world of the Mafia, silence is valued, but communication with the hierarchy is mandatory. Garcia's silence was interpreted as defiance, and his greed was seen as a terminal offense. The eyes of the organization were turning toward the pharmacy manager, the clean-cut assistant who was always at Garcia's side. They were measuring Jesse not for his ability to manage a store, but for his willingness to prove his ultimate loyalty to the blood. During this year of quiet employment, the statistics of Jesse's life suggested a man on the mend. 34 clean tests, 1 steady job, and no new arrests. But statistics are like the surface of a deep lake. They do not reveal the currents moving in the depths. Jesse was not moving toward the light. He was simply waiting in the doorway. The discipline he showed in this job was the same discipline he would soon use to carry out a task that would end the false spring forever. The New Mexican Mafia does not ask its members for service. It demands evidence of their devotion. The pharmacy, with its brightly lit aisles and its promise of a normal life, was merely a stage. The real drama was unfolding in the whispers shared in parked cars and the messages passed in the dead of night. Carlos Garcia believed he had a loyal protege in Jesse, a man he could trust to help him escape to a new life in Texas. He did not realize that the protege he had trained was a man whose soul had been hardened by the very system Garcia had introduced him to. Jesse was becoming a made member, and the price of entry was the life of the person who had called him brother. The false spring was drawing to a close, and the air in Phoenix was beginning to feel heavy with the coming storm. Jesse Conway had played the part of the rehabilitated man with a chilling perfection, but the time for performance was over. The store manager was about to step out of the light and into a laundromat, where the hum of the machines would drown out the sound of a final, terrible betrayal. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, casting long, purple shadows across the shopping centers and the suburbs, the mask Jesse had worn for a year began to slip. The path of redemption was behind him now, a road he had walked but never truly intended to finish. And ahead lay a darkness from which there would be no return. In the quiet, shifting shadows of the Arizona night, trust is a fragile thread, easily unspooled by the heavy hands of ambition and the cold dictates of the underworld. Carlos Garcia was a man who moved through this world with the weary confidence of a seasoned veteran, a made member of the new Mexican Mafia who believed he had found a loyal successor in the quiet, disciplined young man he had taken under his wing. But in the architecture of the gang, mentorship is often a gilded cage, and the bond between the mentor and the protege was about to be severed by a command that echoed from the deep stone silence of the walls. Carlos Garcia had spent years navigating the dangerous currents of the criminal hierarchy, rising to a position of influence where he commanded respect and fear. He viewed Jesse Conway as more than a mere associate. He saw him as a reliable soldier, a man who could handle the intricate details of the gang's business while maintaining the outward appearance of a law-abiding citizen. To Jesse, Garcia was a bridge to a world of power and belonging that had eluded him since his childhood in Manila. They moved together through the streets of Phoenix, conducting the business of extortion and substances, bound by a pact of brotherhood that felt, to Garcia at least, as solid as the desert floor. But the world of the New Mexican Mafia is one of shifting loyalties and hidden agendas, where the light of brotherhood often masks the darkness of manipulation. Carlos Garcia was a man of secrets, and he had begun to keep his most dangerous ones from the very organization that had granted him his status. He had grown weary of the constant demands of the leadership, the endless tithes, and the ever-present threat of the law. He began to envision a life beyond the reach of the Brotherhood, a secret escape to the vast plains of Texas, where he could disappear and keep the profits of his labor for himself. He stopped attending the mandatory meetings, ignored the kites sent from the cells, and began to withhold the money that the gang considered its lifeblood. What Garcia did not realize was that the eyes of the Mafia are everywhere, and his silence was being interpreted as the ultimate act of defiance. The leadership of the new Mexican Mafia, those men who ruled from behind the bars of the state's maximum security units, did not tolerate independence. To them, Garcia was no longer a brother. He was a liability, a loose thread that needed to be cut. And to perform this surgery, they looked to the man who stood closest to him. They looked at Jesse Conway. The command was issued with the cold finality that defines the blood in, blood out philosophy of the gang. Jesse was given a choice that was not truly a choice at all. He could remain loyal to his mentor and share his fate, or he could execute the will of the leadership and finally become a made member himself. For a man who had been seeking a place to belong his entire life, the opportunity to ascend to the inner circle of the Brotherhood was a siren song he could not ignore. The mentorship of Garcia which had once felt like a sanctuary, was now merely a hurdle on the path to true power. The manipulation was subtle and complete. The gang leadership did not simply order the act. They fueled Jesse's resentment, revealing that Garcia had been lying to him about the profits of their work and about Jesse's own standing within the organization. They painted Garcia as a man who was using Jesse, a parasite who would eventually discard him when he fled to Texas. Jesse, whose history was a long chronicle of being used and abandoned by father figures, felt the old, familiar sting of betrayal. The bond of brotherhood dissolved into a cold, calculated desire for advancement. He began to see his mentor not as a friend, but as a target. Carlos Garcia, unaware of the storm gathering around him, continued to lean on Jesse for support. He shared his plans for the move, his fears of the police, and his hopes for a fresh start. He was a man looking for a way out, oblivious to the fact that the man he was trusting to help him was the very one tasked with ensuring he never left. Jesse played his part with a chilling, rhythmic precision. He continued to run errands, to manage the pharmacy, and to listen to Garcia's confidences, all while coordinating with the 2 associates the gang had sent to help him finish the job. The plan was a masterpiece of deception, designed to lure a paranoid man into the open where he felt most secure. Jesse contacted Garcia, claiming he was having a desperate problem with his domestic partner and needed a place to stay. He appealed to Garcia's sense of mentorship, his role as a protector. Garcia, moved by the request and perhaps by a lingering sense of duty to his protégé, offered him a key to an extra apartment he kept. He told Jesse he was at a local laundromat and that he should meet him there to collect the key. It was a mundane setting, a place of steam, the hum of machines, and the scent of soap, a far cry from the violent arenas where Garcia had spent most of his life. In the quiet, late-night hours, the laundromat became a stage for the final act of the false spring. Garcia waited among the rows of washing machines, a man who believed he was performing a final act of kindness for a friend. Jesse arrived, his face a mask of distress, a performance he had perfected during his year as a manager. As they spoke, the 2 associates moved into position, shadows merging with the flickering fluorescent light. The hum of the dryers provided a constant, hypnotic background noise, a sound that would soon be pierced by the sharp report of a device. The betrayal was swift and absolute. While Jesse distracted his mentor with talk of the apartment and his troubles, the shots were fired. Garcia, struck several times, found the strength to flee, his instincts for survival flaring one last time. He ran out into the Arizona night, a wounded animal looking for cover in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. But Jesse and his associate were patient hunters. They caught up to him in the dark, and there, amidst the desert dust and the distant sound of the city, they finished the job. The ending of Carlos Garcia was more than a crime. It was a ritual of ascension. By ending the life of the man who had brought him into the fold, Jesse had proven that he valued brotherhood above all else, above friendship, above gratitude, and above the basic sanctity of human life. He had performed the blood-in requirement with a cold, detached efficiency that disturbed even some of his peers. He was no longer a protégé. He was a maid, member of the New Mexican Mafia, a man who had earned his place through the ultimate act of betrayal. In the aftermath of the incident, Jesse returned to his life with a newfound sense of bravado. He had crossed a line from which there was no returning, a threshold that separated the common criminal from the true initiate of the shadow world. He believed he was now untouchable, a pillar of the organization, protected by the very blood he had spilled. But the law, like fate, is a patient observer. While Jesse celebrated his new status, the invisible threads of the investigation were already beginning to tighten around him. The police had not been idle during Jesse's year of quiet employment. They had been watching the New Mexican Mafia with a steady, clinical gaze, building a case that reached from the streets to the highest levels of the system. They had developed informants, recorded conversations, and mapped the movements of the carnales. Jesse, in his pride, had forgotten that.
Even the made member is visible to those who know where to look. The laundromat at midnight had not been as private as he believed, and the echoes of the shots fired in the dark were already being recorded by the ears of justice. The mentorship of Carlos Garcia had ended in blood, but the lessons Jesse learned from him would carry on. He had learned the art of the mask, the necessity of the shakedown, and the absolute power of the gang. He had become a man who could end the life of a friend and then return to the mundane routine of a store. A man whose empathy had been cauterized by the heat of his own ambition. He was ready for the next level of the game, unaware that the game was already nearing its end. As the desert winds blew the scent of creosote and dust through the streets of Phoenix, the memory of Carlos Garcia began to fade, replaced by the rising legend of the man who had replaced him. Jesse Conway had entered the Brotherhood as a nobody, but he was leaving the false spring as a king of the shadows, a man whose name was whispered with fear in the corridors of the Arizona facilities. The path ahead was one of substance and conspiracy, of secret meetings and recorded betrayals, leading eventually to a federal courtroom and the long, silent road to Pennsylvania. The mentor was gone, but the monster he had helped create was only just beginning to stir, its eyes fixed on a horizon where the iron gates of Canaan waited in the mist. In the quiet, electric hum of the Arizona night, the invisible threads of the law are often woven with a patience that mirrors the slow, inevitable shifting of the desert dunes. While Jesse Conway moved through the streets of Phoenix with the newfound weight of a made member, believing his tracks were washed clean by the blood of his mentor, he was walking into a vast and silent web. It was a world of recorded whispers and staged encounters, a hidden theater where the eyes of justice watched from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the curtain down on the New Mexican Mafia. The arrest of Jesse Conway was not a sudden explosion, but the culmination of a long and clinical observation. Law enforcement had created a specialized task force, a gathering of minds dedicated to mapping the intricate, subterranean nervous system of the gang. They understood that to dismantle an organization as rooted as the New Mexican Mafia, they could not simply strike at its limbs. They had to inhabit its world. They developed a confidential informant, a man who walked the same corridors and spoke the same coded language as Jesse. A ghost within the machine who carried a hidden microphone as his only shield. This informant became the architect of Jesse's downfall, setting up a series of meetings that were essentially masterclasses in the art of the sting. They met in nondescript locations, dimly lit parking lots, quiet street corners, and the interiors of nondescript vehicles, where the air was thick with the scent of exhaust and the low vibration of the city. In these spaces, Jesse spoke with a bravado that would later become his indictment. He talked of substance trafficking, of the logistics of moving narcotics across the state, and most damagingly, he spoke of the unlawful passing of Carlos Garcia. He recounted the betrayal at the laundromat not as a crime,
but as a credential, unaware that every word was being etched into digital memory by the task force listening in the distance. The recordings captured more than just facts. They captured the chilling rhythm of Jesse's transformation. He was no longer the struggling youth seeking a place to belong. He was a calculating operative, discussing the potential for future acts with a calm, detached efficiency. The task force heard the way he prioritized the needs of the Brotherhood over the sanctity of life, and they realized that the ticking time bomb they were monitoring was growing more unstable by the day. To prevent further violence, police moved to accelerate their plan, utilizing the very trade that fueled the gang's power: the distribution of narcotics. The police orchestrated several staged substance deals, a sequence of events designed to trap Jesse in a cycle of undeniable evidence. In the rhythmic flow of these transactions, Jesse was tasked with picking up quantities of substances and delivering them to other dealers. It was the kind of errand he had run 100 times for Garcia, a routine task that felt as mundane as his work at the pharmacy. However, the world had changed around him. The suppliers he met were not carnales, but undercover officers playing their parts with a lethal precision. They handed over the narcotics, watched Jesse pull away into the Phoenix traffic, and then signaled to another team waiting at the destination. Jesse delivered the narcotics to a second set of undercover officers, believing he was strengthening the gang's reach across the city. He moved through the suburbs and the industrial zones. A soldier in a war he thought he was winning, only to find himself surrounded by the very people he had sought to outmaneuver. The arrest was a quiet affair, a sudden closure of the space around him that felt like the slamming of a massive, invisible gate. He was taken into custody, the weight of conspiracy, federal substance charges, and the looming shadow of Garcia ending, falling upon his shoulders all at once. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit rooms of the precinct, the bravado of the street began to meet the cold reality of the law. Jesse was faced with the recorded evidence of his own voice, the digital echo of his betrayals. He did not admit to the unlawful passing of Carlos Garcia at first, choosing instead to navigate the substance charges with the same calculated silence he had used in the yard. He pleaded guilty to the substance offenses, accepting an 11-year sentence in the federal system. It was a significant term, but in the mind of a man who believed in the protection of the Brotherhood, it was merely another period of waiting, a temporary retreat into the familiar embrace of the bars. He was sent to a federal facility to begin his time, but the unlawful passing of Carlos Garcia remained a ghost that would not be laid to rest. The wheels of justice move slowly, especially when they are grinding toward a capital case. 4 years into his substance sentence in 2008, the trial for the ending of Garcia finally arrived. The prosecutors were prepared to seek the ultimate penalty, a finality that seemed to sharpen Jesse's focus. Just before the proceedings began, he changed his plea to guilty. It was a strategic retreat, a trade of truth for the preservation of his own life. He admitted to luring Garcia to his end, to firing in the dark, and in exchange, the state offered him 25 years to life. This sentence was a monumental shift in the geography of his existence. While a life sentence offers distant, shimmering hope of parole with good behavior, it also marks the end of the citizen and the total absorption of the individual into the state. Jesse, however, seemed to view the sentence with a strange indifference. He was a creature of the system now, a man whose identity was entirely defined by the institutions that held him. He was moved through the federal network, eventually finding himself in Victorville Federal Facility in California.
Victorville is a place of stark desert beauty and interior hardness, a facility designed to contain the most volatile elements of the federal population. It was here that Jesse began to exhibit the behavior that would eventually lead him to Canaan. During a routine search of his cell, an officer discovered contraband, a small breach of the rules that most inmates would accept with a quiet resignation. But Jesse followed the officer out into the tier, his voice a low, vibrating threat in the quiet of the unit. He told the officer to be
Careful who he was with, because he just might get hurt. It was an act of pure intimidation, a flash of the made member persona that refused to be diminished by a uniform. A disciplinary hearing followed, and Jesse was found guilty of threatening another person. The Bureau of Facilities, recognizing the growing instability in his profile, moved him again. This time, he was sent to Pollock State Penitentiary in Louisiana, a facility known for its deep-seated tensions and the long, humid hours of southern confinement. It was in Pollock that the violence truly graduated from words to steel. Jesse attacked another inmate, striking him with a blade in the sudden, wordless frenzy of a hit. The inmate survived, but the message was clear. Jesse Conway was no longer just a gang member. He was a predator who sought out the most vulnerable moments to strike. The incident at Pollock triggered another transfer, a rhythmic shuffling of a dangerous man from one corner of the country to another.
Was sent to the federal facility in Coleman, Florida, where he was met by investigators who specialized in identifying the most problematic inmates in the system. One investigator, who interviewed Jesse before he was even allowed onto the yard, recalled the palpable sense of disrespect that radiated from him. He noted the history of violence, the coldness in Jesse's gaze, and the absolute lack of regard for the rules of the institution. He felt with a heavy certainty that Jesse was not just a difficult inmate, but a man who was destined to take a life again. In the Florida heat, Jesse remained an unsettling presence. He gravitated toward a small group of Asian inmates, but even among them, he was an island of unease. He was not liked. He was feared. He moved through the facility with a sense of bravado that suggested the rules of man did not apply to him. And within a few months, he had once again threatened a correctional officer. The staff at Coleman felt the impending danger, and recommendations were made to send him to the ADX, the Supermax lockdown in Colorado, where the most dangerous men are kept in total isolation. But the Bureau of Facilities is a vast and complicated machine, and its decisions are not always aligned with the warnings of those on the ground. The request for a Supermax transfer was denied. Instead, the machine decided to send Jesse Conway to a high-security facility in the misty hills of Pennsylvania. It was a choice that would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, a turning of the page that would lead directly to the silent corridors of USP Canaan. As the transport vehicle moved northward, away from the Florida sun and toward the gray, brooding landscapes of the Northeast, Jesse Conway was a man shrouded in a dark and terrible potential. He was a ticking time bomb whose fuse had been lit in the slums of Manila and shortened in the laundromats of Phoenix. The world was growing quiet around him as he neared the gates of his final destination. But the silence was merely the stillness that precedes the storm, a prelude to the 11 minutes that would forever change the life of Eric Williams and the legacy of the American system. In the vast, interconnected network of the federal penal system, a prisoner is often reduced to a series of digital pulses and paper files, a traveling history that moves through the mail long before the man himself arrives at a new gate. When the transport bus finally wound its way through the rolling emerald hills of northeastern Pennsylvania, Jesse Conway was entering a landscape of mist and stone that stood in stark contrast to the scorched earth of the Arizona desert. Here, nestled near the quiet town of Waymart, stood the United States Penitentiary, Canaan, a high-security fortress designed to hold 1,500 souls within a geometry of concrete and high-voltage wire. To the outside world, Canaan is a landmark of industry and employment, a place where hundreds of local
Citizens don the uniform of the Bureau of Facilities each morning to perform a task that is as essential as it is invisible. But to those within, the atmosphere is one of heavy, vibrating tension, a place often described as the major leagues of corrections. It is a Level 3 facility, a final stop for many before the total isolation of super-maximum security. The men housed here are often serving 25 years to life, their histories written in the blood of high-profile crimes and the politics of the street. In such a place, the rhythm of life is dictated by the standing count, the periodic, absolute silence where every inmate must be visible, every heartbeat accounted for, ensuring that the machine of the facility is still in motion. When Jesse Conway arrived at Canaan in October of 2011, he did so with the quiet anonymity of a man who had learned the value of the shadow. The warnings from the investigators in Florida, the reports of his threats in Victorville, and the attack in Louisiana were all contained within the thick stack of his central file. Yet, in the daily operations of a massive penitentiary, a quiet inmate can often slip through the cracks of administrative notice. To the officers on the range, he appeared to be a loner, a man who did not seek the spotlight of the yard or the loud bravado of the common areas. He was a member of the New Mexican Mafia, yes, but at Canaan, he found himself without a local chapter, an island of one in a sea of different factions. Brian Sudell, a lieutenant at Canaan at the time, would later recall that Jesse was essentially a non-entity during his first months at the facility. In a high-security environment, the focus of the staff is naturally drawn to the loud problems, the visible gang leaders, the inmates who instigate riots, and those who constantly challenge the authority of the guards. An inmate who does his time in silence is often granted a certain level of peace, reciprocal agreement, where the staff leaves the prisoner alone as long as the prisoner remains in the box of the rules. Jesse seemed to understand this equilibrium perfectly. He was a man of the shadows, moving through the dining hall and the laundry with a measured, rhythmic gait that suggested a man who had accepted his lot. However, the silence of a man like Jesse is rarely the silence of peace. It is more often the silence of observation. While the administrators believed they were running the institution, there is an unspoken truth in the world of corrections. The officers may hold the keys, but the inmates often control the yard. With hundreds of prisoners and only a handful of staff in any given unit, the balance of power is a delicate, fragile thing, maintained by a mixture of professional respect and the ever-present threat of force. Jesse watched this balance. He watched the routines of the officers, the timing of the door locks, and the way the shadows fell across the upper tiers during the evening shift. He was a creature of the system, and he was learning the architecture of Canaan with the patient eye of a predator. His first brush with the disciplinary system at Canaan was remarkably mundane. He was sent to the Special Housing Unit, often called the Hole, for a short duration after being caught with hooch, an illicit inmate-made substance. In the ecosystem of a federal facility, being caught with this is a common occurrence, a minor infraction that usually results in a few weeks of isolation before a return to the general population.
It did not signal a deep-seated violent intent. Rather, it reinforced the image of Jesse as a typical, albeit problematic, prisoner who was simply trying to numb the boredom of a life sentence. When he was cleared to return to the compound, he did so without incident, melting back into the background of C Block. This period of Jesse's life at Canaan was a study in the quiet before the storm. He had no close friends, no loyal associates to whisper his intentions to, and no apparent motive for a sudden explosion of violence. The staff, including Brian Seidel, saw no reason to delve into the dark specifics of his past in Arizona or his crimes in the laundromats of the West. In their eyes, he was just another number in the count, another body to be kept alive and breathing until the next shift change. But the bureaucracy had failed to realize that they had placed a mad member of a violent mafia, a man who had already ended the life of his mentor to prove his loyalty, into a high-security environment without the absolute restrictions he had earned. As the winter of 2013 began to settle over the Pennsylvania hills, the atmosphere inside Canaan was growing increasingly strained. The warden had ordered a crackdown on contraband, specifically the blades, or inmate-made weapons that were becoming a frequent discovery during cell searches. The officers were being pushed to conduct more frequent shakedowns, a process that is inherently invasive and often breeds a simmering resentment among the population. To an inmate, a cell is the only private space they have in the world, and to have it shaken down, searched, overturned, and scrutinized is a reminder of their total lack of autonomy. Jesse Conway watched these searches with a cold, mounting pressure. He began to internalize the routine shakedowns not as a matter of institutional policy, but as a personal slight, a narrative he was constructing in the silence of his mind. He was a man who lived by a code of respect, a distorted, criminal version of the word, where any perceived disrespect demanded a lethal response. In the quiet hours of the evening, as the light faded from the small, slit-like windows of C Block, the seeds of a terrible plan began to take root. He was no longer content to be a shadow. He was preparing to become a storm. Among the staff who walked the ranges of Canaan, a 34-year-old officer named Eric Williams. Eric was a man of the region, a former police officer who had transitioned to the federal system for the stability and the opportunity to serve his community. He was known as a good officer, a term that in prison language means a man who is fair, even-tempered, and respectful to the inmates he oversees. He did not yell, he did not bait the prisoners, and he often participated in ministries, seeking to help the men beneath his charge find a path toward something better. To Eric Williams, the inmates were humans in need of a firm but steady hand. He could not have known that to one man in C Block, he was becoming a target for a lifetime of accumulated rage. The tragedy of Canaan was the convergence of these two lives. An officer who believed in the possibility of decency and an inmate who had long ago abandoned it. As the month of February progressed, the rhythmic clang of the cell doors seemed to count down toward a moment of absolute darkness. Jesse was waiting for an opportunity, a lapse in the security of the unit that would allow him to strike without interference. He was sharpening his resolve, just as the other inmates were sharpening pieces of metal against the concrete floors, creating weapons in the dark. The Pennsylvania mist was thick and cold on the evening of February 25, 2013. It was a Tuesday, a day of routine and repetition. The evening shift was beginning, and the officers were moving through the units, preparing for the nightly lockdown. Eric Williams arrived for work, perhaps thinking of his friends in the valley or the quiet life he was building outside the walls. He stepped into C Block, a lone figure in a sea of 1,500 prisoners, carrying only a radio, a pair of handcuffs, and a set of keys. He had no weapon, no spray, and no way of knowing that at the top of a flight of steel stairs, a man was lying in wait. The machine of the facility
continued to hum. The standing counts were performed, and the inmates moved through the tiers in a slow, choreographed dance of confinement. But the balance of power was about to shift. The quiet loner of C Block had finally found the moment he was looking for, a gap in the armor of the institution that would allow him to rewrite his legacy in blood. The air in the unit was heavy with the scent of floor wax and old stone, a silence that felt like a held breath. As Eric Williams began his walk up the stairs to start the evening lockup, the threads of fate were finally pulled tight, drawing the quiet officer toward a confrontation that would leave an entire community in mourning, and the American system forever changed. The evening was still young, and the lights of the distant town of Waymart were just beginning to flicker in the valley, unaware of the horrific display of evil that was about to unfold behind the walls of the fortress on the hill. In the deep, shadowed silence of the Pennsylvania night, the corridors of the high-security penitentiary often pulse with a low electric hum, a sound that mimics the steady breathing of a giant made of stone and steel. To those who walk these halls, the rhythm of the facility is a language of its own, a series of clicks, clangs, and distant echoes that signal the passage of time in a world where the sun and stars are rarely seen. Within the confines of C1 Block at United States Penitentiary Canaan, the air on the evening of February 25, 2013, was thick with the scent of industrial floor wax and the cold, unyielding weight of 1,500 lives held in suspension, unaware that the steady heartbeat of the institution was about to be shattered by a singular, focused intent. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, one must first understand the quiet life of the man who became its focus. Eric Williams was 34 years of age, a man born and raised in the same valley that cradled the facility where he worked. He was a dedicated member of his community, a former police officer who possessed a mild manner and an even temperament, qualities that are as precious as gold in the volatile environment of a federal penitentiary. His colleagues remember him as a man who was not quick to excite, a professional who spoke to the inmates with a steady, respectful tone that bridged the gap between the keepers and the kept. He had participated in ministries and sought to help the men under his charge find a sense of dignity, believing that even in a level 3 facility, a firm but fair hand could maintain the delicate balance of order. As the clock moved toward the evening lockdown, the inmates of C1 Block were in a state of free movement within their unit. This is a time of transition, a period where the day's activities wind down and the men prepare to be secured in their cells for the night. Eric Williams was working alone in the general population area, a standard but inherently dangerous practice, where a single officer is responsible for the safety and security of hundreds of individuals. He was armed with the tools of his trade, a radio, a set of heavy keys, and a pair of handcuffs, but he carried no weapon, no spray, and no shield against the unexpected. His safety relied upon the unwritten social contract, the understanding that if he remained professional and fair, the inmates would follow the routine. But Jesse Conway was no longer operating within the boundaries of that contract. In the weeks leading up to this night, the quiet, Filipino-born member of the New Mexican Mafia had been nurturing a narrative of perceived disrespect. The facility had been conducting a series of shakedowns, searching cells for the illicit weapons known as blades that often appear like weeds in the cracks of a concrete life. Conway had internalized these searches as a personal affront, a targeted harassment that demanded a lethal response in the distorted code of his brotherhood.
He was no longer the loner who kept a low profile. He had become a hunter, and he had chosen his ground. The attack was not a spontaneous eruption of rage, but a chillingly premeditated act. Conway had prepared 2 homemade blades, handcrafted tools fashioned from metal that had been sharpened to a needle point against the very concrete floors he walked upon every day. He chose the upper tier of the block as his vantage point, a position that offered him a tactical advantage and a moment of isolation. As Eric Williams began to climb the steel stairs to start the process of locking the cell doors, he was moving toward a man who had already decided his fate. In a sudden, violent surge, Conway struck. He did not issue a warning or a demand. He moved with the focused physicality of a predator. Eric Williams was knocked down the stairs, falling with a terrible, heavy momentum that sent him tumbling toward the bottom of the unit. The fall was so severe that his radio, his only lifeline to the outside world, was torn from his belt, skittering across the floor and out of reach. In an instant, the even-tempered officer was cut off from his colleagues, alone in a room full of silent witnesses, facing an adversary who had abandoned all remnants of human empathy. What followed was an 11-minute display of depravity that defies the standard definitions of violence. Conway descended upon the fallen officer with the 2 blades, striking with a rhythmic, unrelenting fury. He punched, he kicked, and he struck, his hands moving with a mechanical precision as he sought to erase the life of the man before him. The statistics of the autopsy would later reveal over 200 wounds, a number that speaks to a level of hatred that transcends a simple desire for escape or dominance. This was a ritual of destruction, a manifestation of the blood in, blood out philosophy, taken to its most horrific extreme. Midway through the assault, Conway exhibited a chilling detachment that remains one of the most haunting details of the crime. He paused, leaving the motionless body of Officer Williams on the floor, and walked to a nearby sink to get a drink of water. This moment of quiet hydration in the middle of a slaying highlights the psychological state of the aggressor, a total disregard for the human life he was extinguishing, a calm that was far more terrifying than any frenzied rage. He then returned to the fallen officer to continue the assault, ensuring that there was no possibility of survival. In the cells surrounding the tier, more than 100 inmates stood as silent observers. Not one of them intervened. Not one of them pressed the duress button located within their cells, a button designed for exactly this kind of emergency. The code of silence that governs the yard held firm, even in the face of such a sadistic display. The air in the unit remained heavy, the only sounds being the dull thud of blows and the distant, indifferent hum of the ventilation system. Brian Soidel, the lieutenant on duty, was less than 50 yards away in a neighboring unit, completely unaware that one of his men was being ended in the dark. The discovery was made only when another officer, performing his routine rounds, came across the scene. He found Eric Williams unresponsive, the trauma to his head and body so severe that it was described as the worst sight in the history of the facility. The radio finally crackled to life with a scream for help, a frantic transmission that sent a wave of shock through the institution. As the emergency response team rushed to the unit, they found Conway had retreated into the shadows, his work complete,
his legacy secured in the most terrible way imaginable. Despite the gravity of his injuries, Eric Williams still possessed a faint, flickering pulse when he reached the medical unit. The doctors and staff fought with a desperate intensity to save him, their hands moving through the same
sterile environment where the officer had often spent his time. But the damage was too great. The peaceful officer, the man who had sought to bring a sense of ministry to the fortress on the hill, passed away shortly after arrival. The silence of C1 Block had been replaced by a heavy, mourning stillness that would linger over the community of Waymart and the entire federal system for years to come. As the emergency lights flashed against the grey concrete walls and the inmates were finally secured behind their steel doors, the magnitude of the loss began to settle over Canaan. A dedicated public servant had been taken by a man who saw no value in anything beyond his own distorted sense of pride. And the machine of the facility, though it continued to breathe, would never feel the same again. The investigation was only beginning, and as the search for the weapons and the motive commenced, the shadow of Jesse Conway began to lengthen, reaching toward a federal courtroom in Scranton, where the final judgment awaited. The peace of the valley had been broken, and the story of the officer who never went home was now etched into the stone foundations of the American penal system. In the heavy, echoing aftermath of the storm, the air within the stone corridors of Canaan grew cold and remarkably still, as if the facility itself were holding its breath. The chaotic noise of the response had faded into a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks, the sound of steel locks sliding into place, and the distant, measured footsteps of investigators walking the concrete ranges. Behind the solid doors of the isolation unit, the man who had shattered the peace of the valley stood in the shadows, his hands marked by the struggle, and his eyes reflecting a darkness that no fluorescent light could ever hope to pierce. The identification of the aggressor was a clinical and somber process, conducted with the quiet intensity that follows a tragedy of such magnitude. As the institution moved into a state of total lockdown, officers began the grim task of surveying the cell block, looking for the physical traces of the encounter that had unfolded in the silence of the upper tier. They were searching for signs of a struggle, for the telltale marks of a man who had moved with a frenzied, lethal purpose. It was within the small, confined space of Jesse Conway's cell that the evidence began to converge. The injuries to his hands, the silent testimony of his own flesh, indicated that he had been the one to strike, and his demeanor remained one of a chilling, detached calm. Found within the cell were the instruments of the deed, homemade blades or tools, fashioned from the very materials of his confinement. These were not the tools of a momentary lapse in judgment, but the products of a patient and predatory mind. When confronted by the staff, including Lieutenant Brian Soidel, the inmate did not retreat into denial or a mask of innocence. Instead, he admitted to the attack with a terrifying directness. He spoke of his actions not with remorse, but as a finished task, a requirement of his own internal code. Standing there behind the heavy door, he possessed a sense of dark satisfaction that unsettled even the most seasoned officers. A reminder that, for some, the rules of human empathy have been replaced by a different, more ancient law. The decision was made almost immediately to remove Jesse Conway from the environment of Canaan. In the wake of an unlawful passing involving a staff member, the mechanics move with a swift and heavy certainty. It is a matter of safety, of preserving the integrity of the investigation,
and of preventing the cycle of retaliation that can ripple through a high-security facility like a fever. He was prepared for transport, his hands and feet bound in heavy iron, his journey through the hallways conducted in a silence that felt like a funeral procession. He was moved to the Federal Corrections Facility in Allenwood,
a maximum security facility not far away, but a world apart in its level of control. At Allenwood, the world of Jesse Conway narrowed further. He was no longer a quiet loner in a general population block. He was a high-profile prisoner of the highest risk, a man whose every movement was scrutinized by a specialized team of officers. As the news of the events at Canaan began to spread, reaching the quiet homes in the valley and the newsrooms in the cities, the community was plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. The story of Officer Eric Williams, a man who had gone to work on a Tuesday evening and never returned, became a heavy, lingering cloud over the region. People spoke of the horror of the attack, the sadistic nature of the wounds, and the absolute disregard for life that the act represented. The investigation into the motive behind the incident revealed a narrative of perceived disrespect, a story Conway told himself to justify the unjustifiable. He claimed that Eric
Williams had disrespected him, that the routine shakedowns of his cell were a form of targeted harassment. But those who knew the rhythms of the facility understood a different truth. The shakedowns had been ordered by the administration, not by a single officer, and Eric Williams was merely the man performing his duty with the fairness he was known for. The claim of disrespect was a convenient mask, a way for the inmate to frame his depravity as a matter of honor. In reality, it was the act of a man who enjoyed the power of the blade, a man who sought to elevate his standing within the shadow world by striking at the very heart of the institution. In April of 2013, 1 month after the silence had fallen over C Block, the Bureau of Facilities corrected the error of his previous classification. Jesse Conway was transferred to the highest security facility in the United States, the Federal Supermax in Florence, Colorado, often referred to as the ADX. This is a place designed
for the most violent and unmanageable elements of the human population. A fortress built into the high desert where the architecture itself is a form of control. At the ADX, inmates spend 23 hours a day in total isolation, their only contact with the outside world mediated by thick layers of glass and steel. There are no common areas, no shared meals, and no opportunities for the kind of wait-and-seek predation that had occurred at Canaan. For Jesse, the transfer to the Supermax was the ultimate closing of the gate. He was housed in a pod where the silence is absolute, a world where the only sound is the mechanical hum of the ventilation and the distant clatter of meal trays. It is a life of stone, a perpetual standing count where the individual is reduced to a single, watched presence in a concrete box. The investigators, who had warned of his potential for violence back in Florida, felt a grim sense of vindication, though it offered no comfort in the face of the loss. The ticking time bomb had finally gone off, and the damage it had caused was permanent. 4 years would pass before Jesse Conway stood trial for the unlawful passing of Eric Williams. The proceedings took place in the federal courthouse in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a building of marble and history that stood only a short distance from the valley where the officer had been born. The air in the courtroom was heavy with the presence of Eric's family, his colleagues, and a community that had not forgotten. The guilt phase of the trial was brief, for the evidence was as undeniable as the stones of the facility itself.
The video of the attack, captured by the facility's surveillance cameras, was described as a document of pure evil. 11 minutes of horror that left the jury in a state of stunned silence. During the penalty phase, the defense attorneys sought to find a reason to spare the life of a man who had shown none. They spoke of his difficult childhood in the slums of Manila,
Domestic violence he had witnessed, and the passing of his younger brother.
They presented him as a product of his environment, a man shaped by trauma and neglect. Jesse himself made a statement of remorse, a performance that many in the courtroom viewed with a cold and weary skepticism. To them, it was not the voice of a man seeking forgiveness, but the voice of a predator seeking to avoid the finality of the ultimate penalty. They saw a man who was mimicking the emotions of humanity to preserve his own existence, a final manipulation in a life defined by them. The jury deliberated for a long and agonizing period. The prosecutors argued that the level of depravity, the sadistic nature of the wounds, and the disregard for the laws of both God and man demanded the ultimate penalty. They spoke for Eric Williams, for the sweet-natured man who had been attacked and beaten into the floor of a tear. When the verdict was finally read, it was a moment of profound and complex emotion. The jury was 11-1 in favor of the ultimate penalty. But under federal law, the decision must be unanimous. Because a single juror could not bring themselves to vote for it, the sentence was automatically commuted to life in the facility, without the possibility of parole. The reaction in the courtroom was one of anger and heartbreak. For the Williams family, it felt as if the justice they had sought had slipped through their fingers at the very last moment. To them, and to the officers who had served alongside Eric, the sentence changed nothing. Jesse was already serving a life sentence for the ending of Carlos Garcia. The trial for the passing of Eric Williams had resulted in a penalty that he was already paying. It felt like a hollow victory, a cycle of legal maneuvering that offered no true closure for the wound that had been opened at Canaan. But out of the grief and the perceived failure of the court, a new kind of legacy began to take shape. The parents of Eric Williams,
determined that their son's life would not be defined only by the way it ended, began a quiet and relentless campaign for change. They spoke to legislators, to the media, and to the leaders of the Bureau of Facilities, seeking to ensure that no other officer would ever have to stand alone and defenseless in a sea of high-profile danger. Their efforts would eventually lead to the halls of power in Washington, where a new law would be written in the name of the man who had been lost. As the sun began to set over the hills of Scranton, casting long purple shadows across the courthouse steps, the story of Jesse Conway was moving toward its final, silent chapter. The trial was over, the verdict was sealed, and the prisoner was being returned to the high desert of Colorado to live out the remainder of his days in the box he had earned. The world outside the walls continued to move on, but the memory of February 25th remained a fixed point in time, a moment that would eventually transform the safety of every officer in the federal system and ensure that the name of Eric Williams would be spoken with reverence long after the name of his assailant had faded into the dark. In the hidden, windowless corners of the high-security cell blocks, where the air is stagnant and the hours stretch into years, a quiet and rhythmic sound often vibrates through the stone. A low, persistent rasping that mimics the sound of a cricket in the tall grass. To the uninitiated, it is a background noise easily ignored, but to the seasoned officer, it is the sound of industry in the dark. It is the sound of metal
being filed against concrete, the patient shaping of a weapon from the very skeleton of the facility itself. This is the birth of the blade, a tool of desperate ingenuity that transforms the mundane materials of confinement into instruments of lethal consequence. And in the months leading up to the tragedy at Canaan, this sound was the heartbeat of a growing and silent menace.
To understand the atmosphere of a Level 3 penitentiary, one must understand the secret life of objects. In a world where every movement is monitored and every tool is accounted for, the inmates become masters of a dark alchemy, repurposing the discarded and the ordinary into the extraordinary. A blade is rarely a single thing. It is a category of invention, a sharp-pointed tool born of necessity and hidden in the cracks of the architecture. It might begin as a strip of metal torn from a light fixture, a piece of industrial shelving, or even a section of the steel reinforcing bar hidden within the concrete walls. Through hours of patient labor, the inmate rubs this metal against the abrasive surface of the cell floor or the concrete of the recreation yard, slowly and rhythmically wearing away the excess until a point as sharp as a needle emerges from the gray dust. In the recreation yards of facilities like Canaan, one can often find physical evidence of this labor if they know where to look. Along the edges of the concrete paths, there are deep, smooth grooves worn into the stone. Lines that look almost like the markings of a child's game of hopscotch, but are in truth the sharpening stones of the doomed. Here, under the watchful eyes of the towers, the inmates use the world as their grindstone, their hands moving in a steady, hypnotic motion that matches the pacing of their thoughts. A tool fashioned in this way is not merely a weapon. It is a symbol of autonomy, a declaration that even in a place of absolute control, the individual retains the power to destroy. Some blades are made of hard plastic or plexiglass, materials that can be sharpened to a razor's edge and yet remain invisible to the metal detectors that stand as sentries at every gate. The crackdown at Canaan in early 2013 was a direct response to the proliferation of these hidden tools. The warden, recognizing the rising tide of contraband, ordered a series of intensified shakedowns, invasive and systematic searches of the housing units designed to strip the inmates of their illicit armor. This process is a delicate dance of tension. An officer enters a cell, the only small patch of earth an inmate can call their own, and methodically overturns the mattress, searches the vents, and scrutinizes the few personal belongings allowed by the state. To the staff, it is a matter of safety and the removal of the means of harm. To the inmate, it is a violation of their singular sanctuary, a reminder that they are owned, body and soul, by the institution. Eric Williams was a central figure in this process, not because he was a man of malice, but because he was a man of duty. As he moved through the units, performing the shakedowns with his characteristic fairness and calm, he was removing the very things that men like Jesse Conway relied upon for their sense of status. In the distorted logic of the yard, a man is often only as powerful as the weapon he hides, and to lose that weapon to a shakedown is to suffer a public and stinging disrespect. Conway, watching the searchers from the shadows of his range, did not see a professional officer maintaining the security of a federal facility. He saw a man who was systematically disarming him, a man who was challenging the authority of the new Mexican Mafia with every cell he cleared. The ingenuity of the inmate-made weapon extends beyond the blade itself. To ensure a grip that will not slip in the heat of a struggle, handles are fashioned from layers of athletic tape, strips of bed sheets, or the melted plastic of a discarded toothbrush. These grips are often contoured to the shape of the hand, designed for a singular, horrific purpose. When Jesse Conway prepared for the evening of February 25th, he did not have one weapon, but two. Double-bladed insurance against the failure of a single strike. These were not the crude spikes of a novice, but the refined tools of a man who had already practiced the art of the act in the laundromats of Phoenix and the tiers of Pollock. We must consider the psychological weight of the blade in the hand of a predator. It changes the way a man walks. It changes the way he looks at the officers who walk the ranges. It provides a lethal confidence, a secret knowledge that the power of the radio and the heavy keys is an illusion that can be shattered by a few inches of sharpened steel. Jesse Conway moved through the days leading up to the attack with this confidence, a rhythmic, measured certainty that he was no longer a prisoner, but a judge. The shakedowns that Eric Williams performed were meant to take away the danger, but they inadvertently provided the target, sharpening Conway's resentment until it was as lethal as the metal he hid in his cell. The environment of a high-security facility is designed to be sterile and predictable, yet the presence of the blade introduces an element of ancient, primal chaos. It is a weapon of the shadows, meant for the ambush and the close-quarter frenzy of the tier. As the month of February moved toward its end, the air in C Block was vibrating with the unspoken knowledge that a debt of disrespect was being tallied. The blades were ready, their points hidden beneath the fabric of uniforms or tucked into the crevices of the bunks, waiting for the moment when the rhythmic clang of the doors would stop and the silence of the evening shift would begin. The tragedy of the blade is that it is a weapon that requires intimacy. It requires the aggressor to be close enough to feel the breath of his victim, to hear the sound of the struggle that no radio can capture. Eric Williams, walking his range with nothing but his keys and his handcuffs, was operating in a world where the primary defense was the professionalism of his conduct. He believed that his fair treatment of the men would act as a shield, a social contract that would protect him from the tools he was searching for. But the contract had been shredded by the man in cell number 102, a man who saw the officer's decency as a weakness and the shakedowns as an invitation to war. As the evening shift arrived on February 25th, the sound of filing had stopped, replaced by the heavy silence of anticipation. The weapons were no longer being shaped, they were being held. The lines on the concrete yard remained, quiet, gray scars in the stone that told the story of how the blades were made, but the tools themselves were now moving toward the upper tier. The ingenuity of the desperate had reached its final, terrible conclusion, and the mundane objects of the facility had been successfully transformed into the instruments of a legacy-defining crime. The sun was setting behind the Pennsylvania hills, casting the shadow of the towers across the yard, obscuring the lines and the secrets of the stone. In the quiet of the unit, as the officers prepared for the lockdown, the weight of the metal was the only thing that felt real to the man waiting at the top of the stairs. The rhythm of the facility was about to break, and the low, cricket-like rasping of the files would soon be replaced by a noise that would haunt the valley of Waymart for a generation. A sound of violence that no stone or steel could ever truly contain. February 25th, 2013 arrived as a day of quiet repetition, a Tuesday cloaked in the gray, wintry light of the Pennsylvania hills. Within the high-security walls of Canaan, the passage of time is measured not by the movement of the sun, but by the rhythmic shifts of the men in blue and the steady, mechanical cycling of the iron gates. As the evening hours began to settle over the valley of Waymart, 34-year-old correctional officer Eric Williams stepped into the enclosure of C1 block, unaware that the air within this specific corridor had grown heavy with a singular, predatory stillness.
In the world of corrections, the evening
shift carries its own distinct atmosphere, a transition from the structured activities of the day to the final enclosed silence of the night. It is a time when the unit is filled with the low murmur of over 100 men moving through the tiers, finishing their final tasks before the nightly lockdown. Eric Williams moved through this environment with the calm, practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the service of his community. He was a professional, respected by colleagues and inmates alike for his even-tempered nature and his commitment to the rules of the institution. On this night, he was the lone officer on the floor, a common reality in the staffing patterns of the federal system, carrying only his keys, his handcuffs, and a radio that served as his singular thread of connection to the world beyond the bars. Hidden within the population of C1 block, Jesse Conway had spent the preceding hours in a state of focused, internal preparation. For him, this was not a Tuesday of routine, but a Tuesday of destiny. He had nurtured a narrative of grievance, a story of disrespect that he used to justify the sharpening of 2 homemade blades against the concrete of his existence. He had chosen his ground with the clinical precision of a man who understood the architecture of the unit perfectly. The upper tier, with its narrow walkway and steel stairs, offered the isolation he required, a place where the sight lines were limited and the reaction time of others would be slowed by the very geometry of the building. The attack occurred in a sudden, violent rupture of the facility's equilibrium. As Eric Williams began his walk toward the upper level to initiate the lockdown, Conway was already in position, laying in wait at the top of the stairs. There was no warning, no verbal confrontation, and no opportunity for the officer to utilize the de-escalation skills he was known for. With a sudden, overwhelming force, Conway struck, knocking the officer down the flight of stairs. The fall was a heavy, chaotic momentum of limbs and steel, and when Eric Williams hit the floor below, the silence was total. His radio, the lifeline that allowed him to call for the help of his fellow officers, was torn from his person, skittering across the polished concrete and leaving him effectively invisible to the sensors of the institution. What followed was an 11-minute interval that would forever change the legacy of Cayman. Conway descended the stairs not in a panic, but with a deliberate, rhythmic intent. He reached the fallen officer and began a continuous onslaught, utilizing the 2 blades he had hidden with such care. The violence was sadistic and exhaustive, a manifestation of a deep-seated depravity that saw the human being before him not as a man, but as a canvas for his rage. He punched, he kicked, and he struck, his movements echoing through the unit like the dull, heavy thud of a drum. During the course of these 11 minutes, a detail emerged that highlights the chilling detachment of the aggressor. At one point, Conway paused in his labor. He did not look for an escape, nor did he look for the arrival of other officers. Instead, he walked away from the motionless body of Eric Williams, moved to a nearby sink, and took a drink of water. This act of mundane hydration in the midst of a slaying serves as a window into the cold, calculated nature of the man. It was a break in the work, a moment to refresh the body before returning to finish the destruction of a fellow human being. He then walked back to the officer and resumed the assault, ensuring that no spark of life could remain. Within the cells that lined the tiers, the other inmates watched. There were over 100 witnesses to the event, men who had lived alongside Eric Williams and who knew him to be a fair and decent man. Yet the code, a code built on silence and the fear of retaliation, held every hand in place. There is a duress button located within every cell at Canaan, a simple device meant to alert the control center to an emergency. But during the entirety of the 11-minute attack, not a single button was pressed. The unit remained a theater of silence, the only sound being the mechanical hum of the ventilation and the heavy, rhythmic violence
of Jesse Conway. Brian Soidel, the lieutenant on duty that night, was stationed in a neighboring unit less than 50 yards away. He was performing the routine duties of his shift, overseeing the safety of other staff and inmates, completely unaware that a catastrophe was unfolding just beyond the concrete wall. The design of the facility, meant to contain and compartmentalize, had worked too well. It had created a pocket of absolute isolation where an officer could be within earshot of his friends. The tragedy of Canaan was not a failure of courage, but a failure of the radio, a failure of the button, and a failure of the silence that allowed a predator to work unimpeded.
The silence was only broken when another officer, performing a routine check of the ranges, turned the corner and discovered the scene. The radio transmission that followed was a frantic, high-pitched scream for help, a sound that cut through the low-frequency hum of the evening and alerted the entire facility to the nightmare in C1 block. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a surge of staff moving toward the unit with a desperate hope that they were not too late. They found Eric Williams unresponsive, his body a testament to the level of depravity he had endured. In the medical trauma room of the facility, the staff fought with a quiet, focused intensity. Despite the horrific nature of the injuries, a faint, flickering pulse remained, a testament to the resilience of a man who had spent his life protecting others. The doctors moved with the rhythmic speed of the trained, their hands a blur of silver and white against the gray reality of the situation. But the damage inflicted over those 11 minutes was too vast to be mended by the skills of man. Eric Williams, the mild-mannered officer from the valley, passed away shortly after arrival, leaving behind a community in shock and an institution that would never truly be the same. As the officers moved to secure the unit and the search for Jesse Conway began, the weight of the event settled over Canaan like a heavy fog. The inmates were locked in their cells, the blood was being cleaned from the concrete, and the silence had returned. But it was a different kind of silence, a silence filled with the realization that a fundamental boundary had been crossed. An officer had passed doing a job he believed in, at the hands of a man who believed in nothing but the dark. The lights of the valley continued to flicker in the distance, unaware of the void that had been created on the hill. But as the investigators began to piece together the timeline of those 11 minutes, the focus turned toward the man who had melted back into the shadows of his cell, and the long process of seeking justice for the life that was taken in the dark was only just beginning. 4 years after the silence fell over the hills of Waymart, the scene of the tragedy shifted from the cold stone of the penitentiary to the high, marbled ceilings of the federal courthouse in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The air in the courtroom was thick with a different kind of tension, not the vibrating, dangerous energy of a facility tier, but the heavy, solemn weight of a community seeking a final reckoning. It was here, in the quiet heart of the city, that the long shadow of Jesse Conway would finally meet the measured light of the law, and the memory of Eric Williams would be weighed against the life of the man who had taken it. The trial was a study in profound contrasts, a rhythmic unfolding of facts that sought to find meaning in an act of absolute meaninglessness. To the citizens of the valley and the colleagues who filled the gallery, the proceedings were more than a legal requirement. They were a collective mourning, a slow walk through the details of a day that had changed their world forever. The guilt phase of the trial passed with a swift, almost mechanical certainty. There was no defense to be made against the truth of the surveillance footage, no witness who could contradict the digital eye that had recorded those 11 minutes in C1 block. The jury, faced with the stark reality of the crime,
returned a conviction in a matter of days, confirming what the Valley had known since that cold Tuesday in February. But the true complexity of the trial lay in the penalty phase, the period where the architecture of a human life is dismantled and scrutinized to determine its ultimate end. The prosecution presented the ending not merely as a crime, but as a masterpiece of depravity. They showed the jury the two homemade blades, the clinical precision of the ambush, and the chilling moment when the attacker paused for a drink of water.
They spoke of the over 200 wounds as a manifestation of a soul that had moved beyond the reach of human empathy. For the family of Eric Williams, listening to these details was a second trial, a rhythmic reopening of a wound that had never truly closed, as they sat in the front rows and watched the man who had turned their son into a memory. The defense, in its effort to stave off the finality of the ultimate penalty, turned its gaze backward, toward the distant slums of Manila and the fractured landscapes of Jesse's youth. They brought forth stories of a child raised in the shadow of domestic violence, a boy who had been uprooted and ostracized across 2 continents. They sought to frame the aggressor as a victim of his own biography, a man whose path toward the blood in, blood out philosophy of the new Mexican Mafia was paved with the trauma of his early years. It was a narrative of cause and effect, an attempt to explain the darkness by tracing the flickering lights of a childhood that had failed him. They presented a man who was a product of a violent system, a vessel filled with the rage of 1,000 small rejections. Jesse Conway himself addressed the court, offering a statement of remorse that hung in the air like a cold mist. To some, it sounded like the voice of a man who had finally realized the gravity of his choices. To many others, it was the voice of a predator who had learned the language of the prey. They saw a man who was mimicking the cadence of sorrow to preserve his own breath, a final performance for a gallery that had seen him melt into the shadows of a cell years before. The measured pace of his words did nothing to erase the image of him standing over the fallen officer, and the sincerity of his regret was weighed against the 11 minutes of silence from the inmates who had watched him work. As the jury retired to deliberate, a profound and heavy quiet settled over the courthouse. The decision they faced was a binary one, a choice between the total isolation of a life sentence and the absolute finality of the ultimate penalty. In the federal system, such a decision requires a unanimous voice, a rhythmic agreement from 12 different souls that the crime was so heinous it demanded the ultimate sacrifice. For days, the city waited. The family of Eric Williams waited. The officers at Canaan, who still walked the ranges where the blood had been spilled, waited for a sign that the law valued the life of the keeper as much as it sought to contain the kept. When the verdict was finally delivered, it was a moment that fractured the heart of the valley. The jury had voted 11-1 in favor of the ultimate penalty. 11 individuals had seen the depravity, felt the weight of the loss, and decided that the law required a life for a life. But because of that singular, dissenting voice, a lone juror who could not bring themselves to vote for it, the sentence was automatically commuted to life in the facility without the possibility of parole. In the eyes of the law, the scale had been balanced, but in the eyes of the community, the outcome was a hollow echo of the justice they had sought. The disappointment was a physical presence in the courtroom, a low murmur of grief and anger that the measured voice of the judge could not entirely quiet. To the Williams family, the sentence felt like a technicality, a legal maneuver that ignored the sadistic nature of their son's passing. Jesse Conway was already serving a life sentence for the ending of Carlos Garcia. The trial for the passing of Eric Williams had resulted in a penalty that he was already paying. It felt like a hollow victory,
a cycle of legal maneuvering that offered no true closure for the wound that had been opened at Canaan. But out of the grief and the perceived failure of the court, a new kind of legacy began to take shape. The parents of Eric Williams determined that their son's life would not be defined only by the way it ended, began a quiet and relentless campaign for change. They spoke to legislators, to the media, and to the leaders of the Bureau of Facilities, seeking to ensure that no other officer would ever have to stand alone and defenseless in a sea of high-profile danger. Their efforts would eventually lead to the halls of power in Washington, where a new law would be written in the name of the man who had been lost. As the sun began to set over the hills of Scranton, casting long purple shadows across the courthouse steps, the story of Jesse Conway was moving toward its final, silent chapter. The trial was over, the verdict was sealed, and the prisoner was being returned to the high desert of Colorado to live out the remainder of his days in the box he had earned. The world outside the walls continued to move on, but the memory of February 25th remained a fixed point in time, a moment that would eventually transform the safety of every officer in the federal system and ensure that the name of Eric Williams would be spoken with reverence long after the name of his perpetrator had faded into the dark. In the high, arid desert of Florence, Colorado, where the wind whispers through the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, there stands a silent sentinel of stone and technology, known as the Administrative Maximum Facility. It is a place of absolute stillness, a fortress designed to hold the most volatile echoes of the human spirit in a state of permanent suspension. Within this labyrinth of concrete, in a room where the sun is merely a sliver of light on a high wall, Jesse Conway exists as a shadow within a shadow. His long journey from the slums of Manila and the corridors of Canaan having reached its final, unyielding destination. To understand the nature of this final chapter, one must visualize the architecture of total isolation. The Supermax, or ADX, is not a facility in the traditional sense. It is a laboratory of confinement, a place where the world of the inmate is narrowed to a singular, windowless cell measuring 7 by 12 feet. Here, the furniture is carved from poured concrete. The bed, the desk, the stool, all immovable fixtures in a life that has ceased to move. The sink and toilet are fashioned from stainless steel, reflecting a cold, distorted version of the man who uses them. In this environment, the rhythmic ticking of the clock is replaced by the mechanical hum of the ventilation system, a constant, low-frequency vibration that becomes the only companion to the silence of the soul. Jesse Conway occupies this space not as a leader of the New Mexican Mafia, but as a ward of the most rigorous security protocol in the United States. He is kept in a state of solitary confinement for 23 hours every day. When he is moved, it is in a symphony of iron. His hands are bound, his feet are shackled, and he is escorted by a team of officers who move with a practiced, clinical detachment. There are no communal meals, no shared conversations in the yard, and no opportunities to nurture the disrespect that once fueled his rage. In the ADX, the individual is separated from the influence of the gang and the vulnerability of the staff, held in a stasis that is designed to be as permanent as the mountains outside the walls. While Jesse lives in this world of stone, the legacy of his actions has traveled far beyond the high-security gates of Colorado. The tragedy at Canaan acted as a catalyst for a profound transformation in the way the American system protects those who walk its ranges. For decades, correctional officers in the federal system had operated with a limited set of tools, relying on their professional demeanor and the weight of their keys to maintain order. They were often unarmed, standing alone in units filled with men who had already proven their capacity for violence. But the 11 minutes in C1 block revealed a gap in that armor that could
no longer be ignored by the halls of power in Washington. The Eric Williams Correctional Officer Protection Act, signed into law in 2016, stands as a testament to the resilience of a family's love and the memory of a fallen son. It was a rhythmic, steady march toward progress, led by the quiet voices of Mr. and Mrs. Williams. Because of their advocacy, federal correctional officers are now permitted to carry non-lethal spray, providing a vital layer of defense against the sudden, close-quarter ambushes that define violence. Along with the introduction of more advanced, resistant vests and the implementation of 2 officer shifts in high-security units, the landscape has become a place of greater visibility and swifter response. The injury rates among staff have begun to fall, a decline that is measured in lives saved and families kept whole. In the Valley of Waymart, the memory of Eric Williams is not found in the headlines of the past, but in the quiet safety his colleagues who now walked the ranges with the tools he never had. The community has found a way to weave his story into a narrative of protection and honor, ensuring that his mild manner and his dedication to ministry are the things that endure. Brian Sardell and the others who were there on that Tuesday in February carry the weight of the day, but they also carry the knowledge that the world did not look away. The loss was absolute, but the response was equally profound, creating a legacy of safety that reaches into every federal penitentiary from the coast of California to the hills of Pennsylvania. Within his concrete box in Florence, Jesse Conway is a man whose world has effectively ended while he still draws breath. He is reportedly the only member of his specific brotherhood housed at the ADX, an island of one in a sea of total surveillance. The investigators who once sensed an inherent evil in his gaze now see a man whose eyes reflect only the 4 walls of his cell. He had multiple opportunities to write his path, in the pharmacy of Phoenix, in the programs of Arizona, in the quiet months at Canaan. But he chose the blade and the betrayal every time. He is a perpetrator who has been rendered powerless by the very system he sought to master through fear. The depravity of his actions at Canaan remains a subject of study for those who seek to understand the nature of the criminal mind. Most individuals who endure traumatic childhoods do not go on to commit acts of such calculated, sadistic violence. Conway represents the extreme edge of the spectrum, a man who found in the blood in, blood out code of the Mafia a way to justify a darkness that was already blooming within him. By removing him from the general population and placing him in the total isolation of the Supermax, the Bureau has finally ensured that he can never again use a look or a perceived slight as a reason to strike. He has earned his place in the box, and there he will remain until his threat is finally cut by the shears of time. As the narrator of this story, we look at the life of Jesse Conway not with anger, but with a measured, somber understanding of the consequences of choice. His story is a long, winding road that began in the humid slums of Manila and ended in the dry, high-altitude silence of Colorado. It is a story of how trauma can be forged into a weapon, but also of how a community can take the pieces of a tragedy and build something that protects the living. The fortress at Canaan still stands, and the standing counts are still performed. But the air in the corridors is different now. It is an air that carries the memory of an officer who was loved and a law that was born from his sacrifice. The American system is a vast and complicated machine, a collection of 1,500 souls here and 1,000 there, all moving through the cycles of confinement and release. Within that machine, the ADX stands as the ultimate resting place for those who refuse. The social contract. Jesse Conway is a permanent part of that architecture now. A human being whose legacy is written in the stone of his cell, in the safety of the men who guard him. He is the quietest he has ever been, his bravado silenced by the absolute weight of the state. As the sun sets over the Rockies, casting long violet shadows across the high-security perimeter of Florence, the world outside continues its rhythmic evening transition. In the valley of Waymart, the mist begins to cling to the trees, and the lights of the quiet homes flicker on, one by one. The story of the maid member and the mild-mannered officer has reached its final equilibrium, a balance of memory and stone, of legacy and law. The dark world of Jesse Conway has narrowed to a single point of silence. And as the desert night turns cold and the stars emerge above the fortress, the long watch continues. The gates are locked, the counts are complete, and the valley rests in the knowledge that some shadows, once captured, are never allowed to return. In the hidden windowless corners of the high-security cell blocks, where the air is stagnant and the hours stretch into years, a quiet and rhythmic sound often vibrates through the stone. A low, persistent rasping that mimics the sound of a cricket in the tall grass. To the uninitiated, it is a background noise, easily ignored. But to the seasoned officer, it is the sound of industry in the dark. It is the sound of metal being filed against concrete, the patient shaping of a weapon from the very skeleton of the facility itself. This is the birth of the blade, a tool of desperate ingenuity that transforms the mundane materials of confinement into instruments of lethal consequence. And in the months leading up to the tragedy at Canaan, this sound was the heartbeat of a growing and silent menace. As the final echoes of this journey fade into the stillness of the room, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a deep and quiet reflection. The story of Jesse Conway, of Eric Williams, and of the silent corridors of the American penal system is more than a chronicle of crime and consequence. It is a meditation on the heavy, intricate tapestry of human choice and the enduring resilience of the light. In the silence that follows such a narrative, there is a space for the mind to settle, like dust falling slowly through a shaft of moonlight, finding its place upon the floor of a quiet home. Reflect for a moment on the vastness of the journey we have taken together. We walked through the humid, crowded streets of Manila, where the air was thick with the scent of rain and the sounds of a city in motion. We have felt the dry, unyielding heat of the Arizona desert and the cool, gray dampness of the Northeast. We have seen how a single life can be shaped by the hands of others, by the accidents of geography, and by the silent, internal architecture of the soul. It is a reminder that we are all, in some way, travelers through a landscape we did not design, seeking a place where the air is clear and the heart can find its rest. In the stories of those we have encountered, we find the universal threads of the human experience. We find the longing for belonging, the search for identity, and the profound, often tragic consequences of a path taken in the dark. But we also find the quiet strength of those who refuse to be defined by the shadows. We see the legacy of an officer who lived with a mild manner and a steady hand, and a family that turned their grief into a shield for others. This is the ultimate truth of the human story, that even in the deepest winter, there is a seed of spring waiting to break through the soil. And even in the most silent fortress, there is a voice that speaks for the living. As you settle deeper into the comfort of your surroundings, let the details of the narrative drift away, like the fading notes of a distant song. The names, the dates, and the iron corridors are dissolving into a blur of soft, indistinct shapes. Your mind is no longer a student of history or a witness to the dark. It is a traveler in the realm of dreams, where the laws of stone and steel have no power. The weight of the day, the worries, the tasks, and the lingering thoughts is being lifted from your shoulders, carried away on the slow, rhythmic tide of your own breath. Think of the rivers we spoke of, the rivers of memory and forgetfulness that flow through the underworld of myth. Imagine yourself standing at the bank of a clear, cool stream, where the water moves with a gentle, hypnotic murmur. You can reach down and touch the surface, feeling the coolness against your skin, a sensation that is as real as the bed beneath you. This is the river of rest, a current that carries you away from the noise of the world and toward the silence of the deep. There is no need to swim, no need to struggle. The water is kind, and it knows the way to the ocean of sleep. The stories of the gods and the heroes, the maid members and the keepers of the peace, are all parts of a grander design, a tapestry where every thread, no matter how dark, contributes to the whole. We have looked into the shadow so that we might better appreciate the light. We have walked through the facility so that we might more deeply cherish our freedom. And now, as the night grows older and the house grows still, we find that the light and the shadow are merging into a single, peaceful twilight. Listen to the silence of the room around you. It is not an empty silence, but a full one, a space inhabited by the safety of your home and the quiet presence of those you love. The world outside continues its slow, nocturnal rhythm, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hum of the city, the steady pulse of the stars. All is as it should be. The counts are complete, the gates are locked, and the watch has been passed to the night itself. You are moving now into the final stage of the journey. The words of this story are becoming a low, soothing hum, a vibration that lulls the senses and quiets the mind. Your eyelids are heavy, your limbs are warm, and the bed feels like a cloud that is carrying you through the darkness. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to solve, and nowhere else to be. You have reached the destination. As we close this chapter together, remember that the story of humanity is an endless one, a cycle of descent and return that continues long after the torches have gone out. You are a part of that story, a quiet, vital thread in the fabric of the world. Tomorrow will bring its own light and its own challenges,
But for now, the only task is to sleep, to surrender to the dark, and to find the renewal that only the silence can provide. Thank you for walking this long and winding path with me. It has been an honor to be your guide through the shadows and back toward the light. If you found comfort in this journey, consider returning to these halls again, for there are
always more stories to tell and more silences to share. If you would like to join our community of night travelers and hear more stories designed for the quiet hours, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your presence here helps us continue to build this sanctuary of sound. And if you know someone else who might be seeking a peaceful end to their day, feel free to share this journey with them. But for now, the time for words has ended. The world is still. The breath is steady. The night is yours. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be as vast and peaceful as the stars.